I'm a tycoon in World War I, starting by saving France. Hello again, dear adventurers of the multiverse. Thanks for joining us once more on this epic journey. Remember, this story is pure science fiction from our wild imagination. So don't go trying to summon dragons in your backyard. The rights of this amazing novel belong entirely to its original author. We are only the narrators. Do you want more adventures? Show some love to our YouTube channel with a subscription and a like. And if you want exclusive content, our Patreon is waiting for you with open arms. Chapter 451 FN Arsenal. Antwerp, at Albert I's estate, all was peaceful. After several days of renovations, the estate had transformed from its previous cluttered and dilapidated state into a warm and tidy place. It was lunchtime, and Albert I and Colonel Eton were eating while discussing animatedly. The food was simple, a few pieces of bread and some leafy greens. The only meat dish was a few pieces of fried chicken. I must save all the money to prepare for the defensive system, Albert I said. That's the most important thing right now. The topic of discussion was the defensive system. We've already recaptured 2 strongholds, Albert I asked Colonel Eton, chewing on a dry piece of bread. What can we do now, theoretically, Your Majesty? Colonel Eton replied. According to the Charles's defensive strategy, strongholds are mainly used to store fuel and ammunition. Ghent, as the rear base, should be the most important ammunition and fuel depot. Albert I nodded in agreement. The Liège fortress was too far forward, it would be the Germans' first target. Wait a minute, Albert I felt something was wrong. What about France? Albert I looked up at Colonel Eton, lowering his voice. France was currently an ally, but they couldn't be ignored. And with Ghent on France's side, leaving fuel and ammunition there would expose their weakness. Your Majesty, Colonel Eton raised an eyebrow helplessly. France has Charles, and he's only 18. Albert I instantly understood. Any defense, any preparation, would be useless against Charles, especially since this defense system was built by Charles. Albert I nodded heavily. Keep it in Ghent. Defending against France seemed pointless. Therefore, we can strengthen the fortifications of Ghent, Colonel Eton said. We also need to construct several large warehouses, preferably underground, to avoid being destroyed by enemy aircraft and artillery. He then added, the army's development must keep pace. The defensive system that Charles mentioned places high demands on the army. Yes, Albert I agreed. They must be able to break through enemy lines and quickly penetrate, just like Charles's troops. Only in this way can we connect the various strong points into a unified whole. At this point, Albert I felt a slight unease. He always had a desire to connect the various strong points with trenches, fortifications, or bunkers. He had once asked Colonel Eton about this idea. Colonel Eton replied, this might not be a good thing, Your Majesty. We don't have enough troops to defend such a long defensive line. The result is that the defensive line we build could be exploited by the enemy, and it is armored and mechanized forces that will suffer the most. Albert I thought about it and agreed. These 5 strong points, connected in pairs, had a total of 8 sides, with a total length of at least 500 kilometers. Based on Belgium's population, a standing army could only number a few hundred thousand. A few hundred thousand troops guarding a 500-kilometer defensive line would average only 200 or 300 men per kilometer, barely enough for 1 or 2 infantry companies. If armored and mechanized forces were to be built, the manpower would be even more stretched. Perhaps Charles had considered this, which is why he suggested building armored and mechanized mobile defenses. Albert I sighed inwardly. Lacking military expertise, he always felt a sense of security only when there was something on the defensive line. Otherwise, an empty line, where enemy tanks could easily break through and penetrate deep into the enemy territory, was unsettling. Just as Albert I was lost in thought, a guard stepped forward to report, Your Majesty, Mr. Boyda is outside, please let him in, Albert I ordered. Colonel Eton looked at Albert I somewhat nervously. The owner of the FN Armory. Yes, Albert I nodded calmly. I need to discuss some matters with him. Should I excuse myself? Colonel Eton asked. There are some things it's better he doesn't know. No, Albert I shook his head. There's nothing you can't know. A moment later, an elderly man in his 60s walked steadily into the dining room. His face was covered in wrinkles, but his eyes were bright and piercing, clearly showing he took good care of himself. Albert I rose to welcome him and introduced Colonel Eton to the others. The food on the table was quickly cleared away and replaced with coffee, which the group drank and chatted over. Congratulations, Your Majesty, Boyda said with a smile. We have successfully recovered 1/3 of the land. With Charles's help, the recovery of the rest of the territory is just around the corner. This is also good for you, Mr. Boyda. Albert I met Boyda's gaze. This means your branch factory in Ghent is back with FN, only the main factory in Liège remains. Boyda chuckled. Yes, thanks to Charles. I hope to thank him in person sometime. Of course you will, Albert I continued. He's in Antwerp. If you wish, I can take you to see him now. Boyda chuckled. Your Majesty didn't send me here just to take me to see Charles, did you? At this moment, Boyda was unsure of his relationship with Charles. FN had previously almost monopolized Belgian arms production, although so far it only produced rifles and pistols. It was developing towards machine guns. But Charles's appearance had squeezed out FN's market share. Was he friend or foe? They were enemies, yet his main factory still hoped Charles would reclaim it. They were friends, yet they were destined to become competitors, and formidable ones at that. I heard your company is currently developing a light machine gun, Albert I asked. Any progress? Not exactly development, Boyda replied honestly. We've imported the Chacha machine gun from France and are currently improving it. The image above shows the improved Chacha machine gun from the Belgian FN company. The review process has been delayed again, and we may not see it until tomorrow. Albert I hummed in agreement, elegantly picking up his coffee and taking a sip. Are you doing this to compete with Charles's Saint Etienne II? Boyda's expression changed, and he quickly denied it. No, I didn't have that intention. I just wanted to know about the development of firearms, that's all. As you know, the light machine gun is a new weapon. It's different from both rifles and heavy machine guns, and we don't want to fall too far behind in this area. Colonel Itten, who hadn't spoken until now, paused, glancing at Boyda who was busy explaining, and suddenly understood why Albert I had summoned him. Chapter 452. This is no coincidence. FN did indeed have the idea of improving the Chacha machine gun to compete with the Saint Etienne II. Boyda, after careful consideration, believed that the only potential competitor to FN in the future for Char was light machine guns. Regarding rifles, Belgium had long been equipped with a German Mauser, while Char's factory produced a Lebel. There was no conflict between the two, especially since the Mauser was superior to the Lebel, making a Belgian army unlikely to switch. For pistols, the Browning was superior to the French revolver. Neither of these needed to be replaced by Char's factory, at least for now. However, other weapons such as machine guns, artillery, tanks, and armored vehicles were likely to be entirely controlled by Char, leaving FN with no chance of competing. No, this couldn't be allowed. Therefore, Boyda imported the Chacha machine gun from France, considered a failure and facing obsolescence, hoping to improve it and then compete with Char. One of Boyda's confidences was that FN had a renowned firearms design master, Browning, who was considered a genius. This was a competition between two geniuses, Boyda thought. How could he know who'd win if he didn't try? Let's be frank, Albert I said, setting down his coffee cup and looking at Boyda expressionlessly. In peacetime, I would absolutely support your competition, because competition brings progress. But this is wartime, Mr. Boyda. Our troops are waiting for weapons from the arsenals to reach the battlefield. I would prefer that you cooperate with Charles. Cooperate? Boyda was taken aback. Your Majesty, what level of cooperation do you hope I will reach with Charles? Charles plans to produce machine guns in Belgium, Albert I said. But unfortunately, even with our full support, from site selection to factory construction and production line setup, it might take several months to finally produce the machine guns. We can't wait that long. The enemy is right in front of us, we must drive them out of our land. You hope? Boyda's face paled. You hope our arsenals can produce machine guns for Charles? King Albert I nodded. I'll handle securing the authorized production permit from Charles. Your arsenal will handle production, it only requires some modifications to the rifle production line, and then mass production can begin immediately. This is beneficial for both of us. What do you think? Boyda's expression was uncertain, as if he was finding it difficult to make a decision. King Albert I gave Colonel Itten a wink. Colonel Itten understood and continued, the troops desperately need this machine gun, Mr. Boyda. The biggest drawback of heavy machine guns is their weight. They are difficult to move quickly on the battlefield, and we are always at a disadvantage in terms of artillery fire against the Germans. Heavy machine guns are almost synonymous with death, while light machine guns can solve this problem very well. This was an awkward situation for the Belgian army, a problem they faced when fighting the Germans at the outbreak of World War I. At that time, the Belgian army was only equipped with 102 Maxim heavy machine guns. Initially, these heavy machine guns were considered treasures, but they quickly discovered they were essentially useless on the battlefield. As soon as a heavy machine gun fired, it would be targeted by German 77mm cannons, and soon a barrage of shells would blow it and its gunner to pieces. Given the vast disparity in strength, the weaker side was ill-suited to using equipment with poor mobility. They were better suited to guerrilla warfare. Thus, the need for light machine guns became urgent. "Your decision will save many lives," Albert I pleaded, "even Belgium, and your factories, Your Excellency Mr. Boyda." Boyda hesitated for a moment, then replied, "I will consider it carefully, Your Majesty. Please give me some time." "Of course," Albert I nodded with a smile. Watching Boyda's departing figure, Colonel Itten was somewhat puzzled. "What's he hesitating about?" Colonel Itten said. "That's Charles. Everyone wants to cooperate with Charles. He thinks he has a chance to defeat Charles." Albert I smiled. "Why share profits with Charles if he can monopolize the Belgian arms market? Capitalists always think about maximizing their own profits. Whether the war is urgent, whether more people will die, or even whether the country will be in danger, is not something they need to consider. The fact is, the more dangerous the country is, the more money they can make, because then the country will have to buy at high prices." "Is he crazy?" Colonel Itten still couldn't believe it. "Defeat Charles? Defeat the Saint Etienne? That's the best machine gun, by all accounts, because he has Browning, Colonel," Albert I replied. Colonel Itten suddenly fell silent, a look of realization on his face. In fact, Boyda's success wasn't solely due to Browning. After returning to the arms factory in Ghent, he immediately sought out Browning. The image above shows John Moses Browning, an American, FN's chief firearms designer, who designed many famous guns. Browning was 60 years old at this time, an elderly man with white hair and beard like Boyda, the difference being that Browning's head was balder. Browning was testing the improved Chaussee at the firing range, with several Saint Etienne II machine guns placed nearby. "How is it going?" Boyda asked, stepping forward. "Is it possible to defeat the Saint Etienne II?" Browning shook his head helplessly. "Almost impossible. The Saint Etienne II's design is practically perfect. The rotary magazine effectively solves the problems of magazine capacity and bullet taper. Unless we use the same design, otherwise, then minimize its failure rate as much as possible," Boyda said in a deep voice. Seeing that Boyda's expression was somewhat off, Browning asked suspiciously, "What happened?" "Yes." Boyda's gaze shifted to the few Saint Etienne II machine guns in the corner. "They want us to produce this kind of machine gun." Browning's face darkened. This was practically a forced admission of defeat for FN, a demand to abandon their research and development efforts. "What do you think?" Boyda asked, his voice heavy with worry. Was it truly impossible for anyone to defeat Charles? After a moment's thought, Browning calmly replied, "We have another advantage. FN is a domestic company. As long as the performance difference isn't significant, the Belgian army will still choose our machine gun." Boyda nodded in agreement. This was a matter of national security. Domestic military enterprises were easier to control, while Charles was French. Therefore, as long as the malfunctions of the Chaussee machine gun were eliminated as much as possible, it could still compete with the Saint Etienne II. But just then, his secretary stepped forward and said to Boyda, "Sir, we just received a notification from the provisional government that, due to the documents being burned during the war, we need to reapply for a gun production license." Boyda stared at his secretary in astonishment. He didn't believe this was a coincidence. Chapter 453 I Don't Mind Being Bravo. In Antwerp's Grand Place, the Scheldt River shimmered, boats plying the water, their heavy horns piercing the morning mist to reach a few small tables along the riverbank. At one of these tables sat Albert I, Browning, and Boyda. They were waiting for Charles to discuss military-industrial cooperation. The surrounding area had been cleared of people, not by force, but by Albert I having reserved nearby seats. "This is much cheaper than a hotel," Albert I said self-deprecatingly. "I'm a penniless pauper now, only thinking about saving money." "Your Majesty is thinking of the country," Boyda complimented. "It's a very nice place, the scenery is beautiful." In truth, he wasn't really interested in the scenery. After a moment's hesitation, he cautiously asked, "Your Majesty, may I inquire about the profit sharing from the cooperation with Charles?" Before coming, Boyda had already discussed this with Browning. Since Albert I could block FN's gun production license, the profit sharing was not something they could decide. I've looked into it. Albert I casually raised his coffee cup to the two men. Charles' cooperation with Saint Etienne is a 50-50 split. If it's lower than that, I believe Charles won't agree. He'd rather have Saint Etienne produce this machine gun in Belgium. Don't you agree? Albert I then added, this is advantageous to you, gentlemen. If the Saint Etienne's arms factory is located in Belgium, it won't just be a problem with light machine guns, rifles and pistols could also be threatened. Boyda and Browning exchanged glances. Although what Albert I said was true, a 50-50 profit split. Your Majesty, Browning mustered his courage to object, we need to do a lot of things. For example, the bullets used in the Saint Etienne 2 machine gun are different from ours, which requires improvement. There are also production lines, workers, and so on. Charles doesn't need to do anything, yet he gets the same profits as us. He has the patent for Saint Etienne 2. Albert I interrupted Browning, his voice gradually turning cold. He then put down his coffee cup and nodded towards the statue not far away. Do you know its story? Before the two could answer, Albert I answered himself. His name is Bravo. Legend has it that there was a giant who charged exorbitant tolls from passing captains. The young warrior Bravo cut off the giant's hand and threw it into the Scheldt River. From then on, the Scheldt River was free to flow again. The image above is of the Bravo statue in Antwerp's Grand Place. Even statues have difficulty passing censorship, probably because the statue is naked. I'll have to check again tomorrow. As he spoke, Albert I leaned back in his chair, a cold glint in his eyes. Gentlemen, my idea is simple, to get enough Saint Etienne 2 machine guns to the frontline soldiers in the shortest possible time. If anyone tries to stand in the way and charge exorbitant tolls, I don't mind becoming Bravo. Boyda and Browning exchanged a glance, both seeing fear in each other's eyes. Boyda even lowered his hand from the table, glancing at the sword at Albert I's waist, seemingly worried that Albert I might suddenly attack. Just then, the sound of a car engine approached. Albert I's gaze shifted, his face instantly beaming with a smile. He's here. As he rose to greet him, Albert I didn't forget to ask, do you agree with my plan? Yes, Your Majesty. Of course, Your Majesty. Albert I nodded in satisfaction. Very good. I believe this conversation will be pleasant. Boyda's expression was uncertain. He couldn't understand why the usually amiable and approachable Albert I had become so dictatorial. Browning seemed to see through Boyda's thoughts. As he rose, he whispered, it's because of the war, sir. Extreme measures taken for victory. Boyda hummed in agreement, and besides, it wasn't too extreme. At least he had left FN a way out. After Charles sat down, the first sentence he heard surprised him. We hope to cooperate with you, Mr. Charles, Boyda said sincerely. If you are willing to authorize us to produce the Saint Etienne 2 machine gun, we are willing to split the profits 50-50 with you. This was different from Charles's cooperation with Steed, although the profits were also split 50-50. Steed received Charles's first-hand design, and the machine gun was named Saint Etienne 2. The Saint Etienne armory reaped many benefits beyond the initial profit, such as advertising and innovation, which would make the world trust the Saint Etienne armory more. This is often more important for military enterprises, because it is the foundation for building a brand effect, and whatever Saint Etienne produces in the future will fetch a good price. But FN Company was actually willing to split the profits 50-50 with Charles for authorized production, which seemed a bit excessive. Charles glanced at Albert I sitting beside him and seemed to understand that this was likely the result of Albert I's mediation. Charles smiled slightly, a smart move. On the one hand, the Charles can act as a catfish to stimulate the Belgian military industry, preventing monopolistic military enterprises from arbitrarily raising prices during times of war. On the other hand, it can also tightly bind the interests of the Charles to those of Belgium. If the Charles fails to defend Belgium in the future, it will lose a large amount of revenue for no reason. Licensed production is no problem, Charles nodded, glancing at Browning sitting next to Boyda, and said, but your plan to modify the Saint Etienne II to use the 7.92mm ammunition for Mauser rifles might present some issues. Albert I was more nervous than the others, quickly asking, what issues? First, the patents, Charles said. After you improve the Saint Etienne II, will the patents for the improvements be yours or mine? That's not a problem, Albert I readily agreed. We can also purchase the patents for the improvements. Charles hesitated for a moment, then said, how about this? You can own the patents for the improvements, otherwise, you wouldn't be considering how to improve it, which is detrimental to the development of the Saint Etienne II. That's wonderful. Boyd and Browning were overjoyed. This meant they could participate in the subsequent development of the Saint Etienne II. Otherwise, whether improvements could be made would require Charles's consent, and even then, patent fees would have to be paid. However, Charles added, similarly, if FN Company firearms are involved, we should also have patents for improved versions, don't you think? Of course, Boyd and Browning nodded repeatedly. This was fair, this was cooperation, mutual exchange. What they didn't know was that they had fallen right into Charles's trap. Charles had his eye on Browning's shotgun design. Chapter 454 Trench Cleaner. Browning was a remarkable figure, successfully designing and producing 37 different firearms. His works include the internationally renowned Browning pistols and the M1911, the standard issue pistol used by the United States for decades. However, what truly captivated Charles was his shotgun. The latest shotgun was the Browning A5. Besides being produced by FN in Belgium, it was also licensed to Remington in the United States, who named it the Remington M11. The image above shows the Browning A5, also known as the Remington M11, nicknamed Hunchback due to its unique high-tail design. Production began in 1902 and continued until 1998, with an estimated 850,000 units produced. At the time, shotguns were generally disliked in Europe, as their range was considered too short, only around 40 meters, far inferior to the hundreds of meters of range of rifles. Therefore, neither side in combat valued them and, consequently, did not equip themselves with this type of weapon. Only the American Army, retaining some of its cowboy spirit, truly appreciated this high-powered rifle, even modifying it into a military version, the Winchester 1897. When the American forces entered the war in 1917, the shotgun immediately demonstrated its astonishing power on the battlefield. The confined space of trenches made long rifles difficult to operate, and bolt-action rifles had a slow rate of fire, firing only one bullet at a time. Shotguns, however, could fire multiple bullets in quick succession, creating a three-dimensional attack on the enemy. Furthermore, trench warfare, being close-quarters combat, made the shotgun's limited range less significant. This gun terrified the Germans, to the point that they demanded a ban on its use as a combat weapon, deeming it inhumane. The image above shows the Winchester Model 1897 shotgun, known as the trench sweeper, used by the U.S. military. Also designed by Browning, it was slightly outdated compared to the Browning A5. The former required manual reloading, while the latter was semi-automatic. What Charles wanted was the right to improve the Browning A5, which had a longer barrel and lacked a bayonet lug compared to the military version of the Winchester Model 1897. These features were disadvantageous in trench warfare, as the bayonet was needed immediately after firing. Furthermore, Charles could implement improvements that even Browning himself was unaware of, such as increasing its range and effective dispersion. However, Charles wasn't foolish enough to bring it up now. He calmly continued the previous topic. Another problem, you're using the same bullets as the Germans, gentlemen. Have you considered this? Charles glanced at everyone and said, this means that once the Germans capture your machine guns, they can immediately turn them on you, or on us. Everyone was stunned by this. But that won't solve anything, Albert, I said after a moment of silence, unless we use the level rifle. Boyd's eyes widened immediately. This practically meant the end of all FN Company orders. Charles calmly replied, my suggestion is to use the original Saint Etienne II machine gun until the partisans are fully operational. Although it will cause some supply disruptions, the advantage is that even if the machine gun is captured, it won't be used by the Germans. Later, when the partisans are more combat-ready and less easily defeated by the enemy, and the Germans have their own light machine guns, the capture problem will no longer exist. Albert, I nodded repeatedly with a no. That's right, Brigadier General. Moreover, we won't be able to enter mass production so quickly. There will be a gap in the light machine gun supply. During this time, we can purchase them from France instead of waiting for them to be produced. This will also allow our troops to familiarize themselves with a light machine gun in advance. Charles nodded. That was exactly what he wanted to say. Everything was in the best interest of the war. The only drawback was that Albert I would have to spend more money, while Charles would make more. Boyd breathed a sigh of relief upon hearing this, secretly feeling fortunate. The guerrillas used all sorts of guns, and if Charles suggested replacing all rifles with level rifles, Albert I who was completely obedient to Charles, might actually agree. The next day, Charles woke up in his dormitory at the Antwerp airfield. By this time, the German forces in Antwerp had been largely cleared out, and Charles no longer needed to keep his command post in such a harsh environment as the fortress. The best location was the airfield. Of course, this required the deployment of fighter jets. Charles immediately widened the Antwerp airfield, transported fuel and spare parts, and set up air defenses in front of the airport before a squadron of camel fighters and the command post could be deployed there. Charles's actions once again amazed Digny. My God, our air superiority has instantly advanced by 200 kilometers. We can say we have complete control of the Belgian skies. Note, the camel fighter has a range of 485 kilometers. This seemed ordinary to Charles, but Digny exclaimed as if he had discovered a new continent. And Brussels, Mons, General, Charles said, pointing to the map while munching on his bread. Building airports in those two cities and stationing fighter jets there, that's true control of the Belgian skies. Digny nodded, then asked, when do we launch a new offensive? Everyone's waiting. Charles didn't answer, his eyes fixed on the map as he continued eating his bread. This included King Albert I and Colonel Eaton, though their guerrillas weren't ready. Some say we should press our advantage, Digny continued, urging, the longer we wait, the better the Germans will prepare. The Germans are ready, General, Charles replied. Anti-tank ditches, plus the fortifications left behind by Belgium. Ahead lay several formidable obstacles, Namur Fortress, Leuven, and Liège Fortress, considered Belgium's first fortress. The Germans had built a new defensive line against Charles's armored forces, relying on existing Belgian fortifications and cities. The most troublesome of these was the anti-tank ditches, which prevented the armored forces from breaking through quickly. The Germans are making progress, Charles chuckled softly. They've learned our tactics and developed many countermeasures. You must have a solution, Digny said, smiling at Charles with confidence. Charles smiled but remained silent. He was waiting for the new equipment from the Saint Etienne arsenal. Just then, a guard entered and reported, Brigadier General, an instructor named Dominic wants to see you. Here he comes, Charles thought. Dominic brought newly developed submachine guns, awaiting Charles's approval before mass production. Chapter 455 Popod. Dominic arrived by train, despite Steed's repeated insistence. I hope to know the answer as soon as possible. It's important for Saint Etienne. After much hesitation, Dominic ultimately chose the train. This wasn't just because he wasn't psychologically comfortable with airplanes, but also because he disliked the feeling of instability in the air. He only felt safe when his feet were firmly planted on the ground and he could feel the pistol tucked in his side. Paris is about 350 kilometers from Antwerp, and with a journey involving giving way to military trains, the trip took a full 13 hours, including an overnight train ride. When the car stopped in front of Charles's command post, Dominic was still yawning. Once allowed inside, carrying his suitcase, he suddenly tensed. This submachine gun hadn't been developed entirely according to Charles's vision. He wondered if there would be any problems. Hey, Colonel, Charles greeted him warmly at the door, shaking hands with Dominic and asking, have you had breakfast? The tongue-tied Dominic was taken aback. No, General. But it's all right, I don't have an appetite, I'm not really hungry. That won't do. Charles immediately ordered the orderly to prepare food, turning back to Dominic and saying, while it may not be the gourmet food you're looking for, there's plenty to eat. Charles led Dominic into the conference room. The fewer people who knew about the new equipment, the better. It would have a significant impact on future battles. The airport conference room was somewhat messy. The wall facing the runway was charred and hadn't been repainted, and the room smelled slightly burnt. Excuse me, Charles settled into a chair and said to Dominic, who was munching on bread with hot milk, there was a fairly large battle here not long ago. I heard about it. Dominic nodded, answering indistinctly between bites, a hint of envy in his eyes. You launched a surprise attack at night and recaptured Antwerp in just a few hours. A remarkable battle, General. Everyone's talking about it, the newspapers too, and they still are. Charles smiled slightly, accepting the praise. The battle, which began in Cambrai and ended in Antwerp, had been compiled into textbooks and sent to the St. Cyr Military Academy, requiring every cadet to read and discuss it. Is that a new submachine gun? Charles's gaze turned to the gun case Dominic had brought. Yes, General. Dominic stuffed the rest of his bread into his mouth, took the gun case, and pushed it towards Charles. hesitating for a few seconds. Under Charles's questioning gaze, he finally mustered the courage to open it. Charles exclaimed "Huh?" with a surprised look when he saw the submachine gun. He thought he would see an MP-18, but what he saw was the Soviet PPD, which was developed around 1934. He didn't expect that Dominic would have it now, almost 20 years ahead of schedule. The images above show the PPD, PPSH, and PPS submachine guns, respectively, which were issued to the Soviet Army before, during, and after World War II. The first two are very similar, with the biggest difference being the handguard. The PPD's handguard is divided into two sections, and the parts need to be milled, which is not suitable for mass production. The PPS's receiver and handguard are one piece, and the parts are stamped, allowing for mass production in a short time. I know, General. Dominic looked at Charles nervously, stammering. You mentioned before that you wanted to move the magazine to the side, but that would cause problems with its large capacity drum magazine. You said that the magazine capacity of a submachine gun is very important, so I tried to increase the magazine capacity as much as possible, but after loading 71 rounds, the drum magazine weighs 3.6 pounds, which doesn't seem suitable for the side, so Dominic's words were incoherent, but Charles understood. The drum magazine with 71 rounds was too heavy, and placing it on the side would make the gun unbalanced, so it could only be moved to the bottom. Charles picked up the drum magazine and weighed it in his hand. It was indeed quite heavy. This is excellent, Colonel, Charles praised. Better than I expected. This was true. The PPD was comparable to the German MP-38, and of course, it was more advanced than the MP-18. Is that so? Dominic finally relaxed, his face showing relief. I was worried that the battlefield might require the magazine to be placed on the side due to its high rifling. While that is indeed a problem, a 71-round capacity is tolerable. Charles took aim at the gun, without testing it or asking for specific data, and directly ordered mass production immediately. I might need 200 next month. Yes, General. Dominic's voice became crisp again. After a pause, Dominic hesitated before asking, General, there's something I shouldn't ask, but my father is deeply uneasy about it. Steed. Charles looked at Dominic with a puzzled expression. Uneasy? Yes, why? Charles asked, then immediately understood. Is it because of my cooperation with FN? Yes, Dominic nodded. We know it's your prerogative, General. But after all, FN is also a small arms manufacturer, and quite powerful. Steed worried that if Charles had FN, would he no longer need Saint-Étienne? Charles laughed heartily. Let him rest assured. In the military industry, the most trustworthy people are always our own. The military industry has a strong national character. Although it's a private enterprise with considerable freedom, just as Albert I easily controlled FN, governments of various countries maintain varying degrees of control over military enterprises. If France and Belgium were to go to war one day, Charles and FN would undoubtedly become adversaries. This was an indisputable fact. Dominic thought so too. He actually thought so too, but he still wanted to confirm with you. With you saying that, he can rest assured, this was a case of concern clouding his judgment. Charles didn't say much about it. He instructed the orderly outside the door, and soon 2 shotguns were brought into the conference room. These are 2 shotguns produced by FN. Charles nodded at them. The long-barreled one is the Browning A5, and the short-barreled one is the Winchester 1897. I know. Dominic casually picked up one and tried it out. Our company has researched this gun, but Dominic looked up at Charles, a hint of confusion in his eyes. We all agree that this gun's range is too short, only suitable for hunting. The general means, combining the advantages of these 2 guns, Charles said, shorten the barrel of the Browning A5 and add a bayonet lug. Dominic didn't say anything. These 2 improvements weren't difficult, even quite simple. However, modifying it into a military version was clearly for equipping the army. Was it really suitable for equipping the army? Chapter 456 The Feeling of Being Valued. Charles waited for Dominic to ask a question, but Dominic dawdled, fiddling with his shotgun and glancing at Charles, looking like he wanted to say something but didn't. Please, Dominic, Charles said with a wry smile, holding his coffee, you're a completely different person now than when you're shooting. Well, that's different, General, Dominic replied, slightly embarrassed. I only feel confident when I have a gun in my hand. You're holding a gun right now, Charles said, waving his coffee cup at the shotgun in Dominic's hand. And a high-powered one at that. I mean target practice. Dominic scratched his head. Or when designing firearms, why? Charles asked, puzzled. Dominic shook his head slightly, his gaze shifting to the shotgun in his hand, lost in thought. I don't know. Perhaps, besides guns, I don't have anything I like or am good at, which is why I'm always isolated. That's enough, Charles said confidently. This is wartime, and you've designed such an excellent submachine gun. That surprises me. Is that so? Dominic chuckled, a little embarrassed by the praise. Of course, Charles replied. Have you heard of Browning in FN? Dominic nodded emphatically. Yes, General. Of course I know him. Everyone in the military industry knows him. He's a genius firearms designer, and Winchester clearly didn't realize that. It missed a huge opportunity for development. Charles understood what Dominic meant. Browning was originally with Winchester in the U.S., but at that time, American capitalists generally lacked strategic vision, and Winchester and Browning had a falling out over a contract. Browning wanted to independently own the industrial property rights of firearms, while Winchester wanted to buy it outright. It's a joke. Developing a single firearm could earn enough to pay for a lifetime salary, yet Winchester wanted to buy out a portion of it, and all of Browning's inventions. Only a fool would do that. So Browning resigned, hoping to join Remington, but unfortunately, the owner of Remington passed away around that time. Ultimately, Browning traveled all the way to Belgium to become FN's chief firearms designer. It's said that FN was on the verge of bankruptcy at the time because it couldn't compete with Mauser in Germany, and it planned to completely abandon the military industry and switch to bicycle production. Browning's arrival allowed FN to rise rapidly and secure a place in the military market. Dominic is referring to this process of Winchester missing out on Browning. The image above shows a motorcycle produced by FN in 1914. FN, originally a Belgian motorcycle company, also produced automobiles, entering the military industry by copying German Mauser rifles. Charles nodded to Dominic and said, word by word, you're no less than Browning, Dominic. I hope you can become the Browning of Saint Etienne? Dominic was startled. No, General. I'm far inferior to him. You don't understand. For example, this gun, Dominic, holding a shotgun, said, this is Browning's design. It's very suitable for civilian hunting. Think about your own designs. Charles interrupted him. Saint Etienne and this submachine gun, but Dominic blushed. They are actually your designs. To be precise, my ideas, or my needs, Charles corrected. You turned them into reality. Am I wrong? Dominic considered for a moment, then nodded slightly. If there's any problem, it's that Charles's requirements and ideas are too detailed and clear. It's practically sketched out the whole picture in Dominic's mind, or rather, it's already largely completed the design. Dominic just needs to implement it. Charles asserted, there are still many things waiting for us to design. You might even surpass him. Understand, Charles used we, not I, meaning Dominic was also part of it. Charles didn't mind sharing some industrial property rights with Dominic. For example, Dominic had made significant contributions to the PPD submachine gun. This was a way to win over subordinates and ensure their unwavering loyalty, and also a plan Charles was making for future cooperation with Saint Etienne. Charles believed Dominic should be the heir to Saint Etienne, not his brother, Liam. Yes, General. Dominic understood, nodded heavily, and looked at Charles gratefully. Dominic then added, thank you, General. It's not just because of that. Dominic didn't care about industrial property rights. He didn't even care about Saint Etienne. What he needed was this feeling of being valued and respected. Charles smiled and nodded to indicate he understood. He then put his coffee cup on the table, nodded towards the shotgun to encourage Dominic. Tell me, what do you think is wrong with this gun? It's fine, General. Dominic replied, but I think it's only suitable for hunting, not for the battlefield. Its range is too short, only about 40 meters. If the enemy has a rifle, we'll be down before we even get close enough to pull the trigger. Anything else? Charles asked. Its dispersion area is large, and many shots are ineffective, Dominic explained, gesturing as he spoke. We can imagine its bullets as a ball of cotton emerging from the muzzle, then radiating outwards, getting larger and larger. By 40 meters, the gaps between the bullets are large enough to accommodate several people. What I mean is, even if we aim accurately at the target, and the enemy is within range, he continued, we may still fail to take them down, or hit by one or two bullets without being fatal. Charles nodded. Dominic, as expected of a test shooter, had a very insightful analysis of shotguns. Range and bullet dispersion were always unavoidable issues for shotguns. They were only useful in specific environments such as trenches and urban warfare. But what about other situations? In relatively open areas, were soldiers with shotguns simply helpless, waiting to die? What if I told you I have a solution to these problems, Charles said, or a partial solution? Dominic laughed. That's impossible, General. If these problems could be solved, it wouldn't be a shotgun. But seeing Charles's serious expression, Dominic was taken aback. You don't actually have a solution, do you? Chapter 457 Duckbill Dart. Charles picked up paper and pen, and while drawing, he said to Dominic, perhaps we can design the muzzle like this, with openings on both sides in a duckbill shape. Dominic stared blankly at Charles's drawing. I've never seen such a strange muzzle before. What use could it be? Charles put down his pen and raised an eyebrow. Dominic suddenly realized, it wouldn't be changing the dispersion pattern, would it? You guess right, Charles replied. The openings on both sides will make the bullets disperse more horizontally than three-dimensionally. Charles then picked up his shotgun, gesturing towards a row of neatly arranged chairs in the conference room. Think about it, Dominic. On the battlefield, we're more often facing a row of people standing in front of us. After firing, bullets flying upwards or downwards are ineffective. They either fly into the air or hit the ground. Only horizontally fired bullets can effectively kill the target, Dominic exclaimed. The openings on both sides mean that the bullets won't be a cotton ball when fired, but rather, a fan. A very good analogy, Charles praised. Just like a fan, it obviously improves the hit rate because the bullets are concentrated towards the target, Dominic sighed. Such a small modification can have a big impact. All we need to do is cut a muzzle. No, Charles interrupted Dominic. I'd prefer it to be an accessory, like a bayonet, something you can choose to attach or not. Dominic nodded repeatedly. Sometimes we still need a cotton ball instead of a fan, yes. Like when shooting at windows or doorways in alleyway warfare, what's needed is indiscriminate killing of enemies indoors, not just a specific surface. The image above shows a shotgun with a duckbill, which appeared during the Vietnam War. But what about the range? Dominic looked at Charles expectantly, eager to know how the range could be increased. It's simple. Charles picked up a shotgun shell and waved it in front of Dominic. Its range is only 40 meters because it fires a projectile. Dominic nodded. The projectile tumbles in the air after being fired, consuming a lot of kinetic energy during the tumbling process. Additionally, its contact area is also a factor. We can't change that, Dominic frowned. Unless we can make it spin like a bullet, only then is it possible for it to fly stably in the air. That's why our rifle barrels are rifled, and it's the difference between rifled and smoothbore guns. But Charles shook his head. He put down his gun, picked up his pencil again, and started drawing as he spoke. It's not just bullets that can fly stably, Dominic. Open your eyes, use your imagination, and you'll find there's also this. With that, Charles pushed the drawn dart in front of Dominic. The image above shows darts for a shotgun, a modification from the Vietnam War era, which increases the range to about 300 meters. The image above shows the dispersion of shotgun pellets after attaching a duckbill. It clearly shows that vertical dispersion is almost non-existent, with most of the dispersion being horizontal. Dominic's eyes widened instantly, and he was stunned for a moment before exclaiming, darts. Changing the pellets to darts. You're a genius, General. Unbelievable. I mean, it's a really great idea, so simple, but nobody else has thought of it. Nobody could have imagined it. Can it be done? Charles asked, but that was a redundant question. Yes, of course. Dominic nodded repeatedly. Also, 200 shotguns next month, Charles said, including the ammunition. Dominic didn't hesitate and immediately agreed. No problem, General, I guarantee it. These modifications were too simple, with no technical barriers. All that was needed was to buy original shotguns from FN, make slight modifications, and then produce the darts himself to meet the requirements. Even so, its potential impact was unimaginable. Its range might be several times greater than before. Thinking of this, Dominic was incredibly excited. He couldn't wait to produce this shotgun. Paris, 16th arrondissement, Chateau Steed. It was grape harvest season. The grapes at the end of July were just right. In previous years, Steed would personally direct his servants to harvest the grapes on the estate and then make them into red wine. Every step had to be satisfactory and closely supervised. Steed didn't trust outsiders. This wasn't just a matter of quality, but also an extra layer of protection for his personal safety. But this time, Steed had no interest in winemaking. He let his servants work busily outside, while he paced anxiously in his study, leaning on his cane, glancing at the phone every now and then. Ring ring, the phone rang, and Steed rushed over. He was disappointed when he answered. It wasn't Dominic calling. Yes, Mr. Commissioner, add 2,000 more light machine guns, Saint Etienne II, on-time delivery guaranteed. After hanging up the phone, Steed sighed softly. Compared to business, he would rather know a little about Charles's intentions. What was wrong with Dominic? It had been 2 days without a word, as if he had disappeared. He had been told to take a plane, but he insisted on taking the train. Suddenly, hurried footsteps came from outside the door. Dominic pushed open the door, carrying a gun case and sweating profusely. He said to Steed, "Father, I'm back. I brought Charles's new design." "You will be very surprised." Steed stared at Dominic in disbelief. That bastard. He knew he was eager to know Charles's intentions, yet he didn't make a single phone call. Even if he couldn't get through by phone, sending a telegram wouldn't be difficult. How could Steed have imagined that after talking with Charles, Dominic's mind was filled with a series of miraculous improvements to the shotgun, and he had long forgotten about phone calls and telegrams. Before Steed could speak, Dominic, even more eager than him, skillfully placed the gun case on the desk and opened it. Inside were 2 shotguns. Dominic's face lit up with excitement. "Charles wants us to combine the advantages of both guns and modify them." Even more incredible is this, he unfolded the drawings he had made on the train and leaned close to Steed, saying, "Charles' design, with just simple modifications, can increase its power and range. I'm not sure if it will be successful yet, we'll have to produce it and test it to know, but Charles is always right, and this time will be no exception." Steed looked at the sketches and suddenly felt a sense of relief, then let out a long sigh, his eyes shining with joy. Yes, Charles is always right. Chapter 458 Romania. Charles had been quite busy lately. While the land defenses were no longer his concern, that was the responsibility of Foch's 9th Army. The aircraft and bombers required his command. Antwerp, Brussels, and Mons each received an air squadron of approximately 20 of the most advanced Camel fighters available at the time, and Ghent received 2 bomber squadrons from an additional airfield, thus securing the Belgian defenses. Seeing Charles's relieved expression, Tycoon asked, somewhat puzzled, "Brigadier General, you seem to have more confidence in the aircraft than in the trenches." "Aircraft are everything, General," Charles replied. "They were force multipliers for the army, and could also suppress enemy artillery, logistics, and ammunition depots, making warfare much easier." Tycoon raised an eyebrow, not taking Charles's words seriously. Charles didn't elaborate. People of this era hadn't fully grasped the importance of air superiority, making it difficult to explain. Just then, a guard came in and reported, General Gallieri is here." "He's outside, General Gallieri." Charles thought he'd misheard. He should be in Paris. However, a quick glance revealed Gallieri at the command post entrance, accompanied by 2 guards. Gallieri strode confidently into the command post, looked at the bewildered Charles, and asked with a smile, "Is everything all right, Brigadier General?" "Yes, General." Charles snapped out of his daze, quickly offering Gallieri a seat, then instructing the orderly to make coffee. As soon as the orderly left, Charles suddenly remembered something and called after him, 2 sugar cubes, and extra water." "Yes, General," the orderly replied. A hint of relief flickered in Gallieri's eyes behind his glasses. This guy remembered his habits. "We've come to check on the defensive lines," Gallieri explained. They planned to have the reserve army group take over the recaptured territories in Belgium. Charles said "Oh," and sat down opposite Gallieri. They planned to launch an attack on the German forces. It wasn't hard to guess. With the reserve army group advancing, the 3 main army groups, Northern, Central, and Eastern, could be freed up to launch an attack on the enemy. Gallieri didn't speak, only glancing slightly to his sides. Charles understood and led Gallieri into the meeting room. Coffee was brought in, and Gallieri took a sip, waiting for the orderly to leave and close the door before saying, "They believe the war may be over. This isn't a small-scale offensive, but a general offensive, a full-scale attack." Charles was startled. His first reaction was that something was wrong. It was only 1915, although progress was going well, the war was far from over. Launching a general offensive now would obviously not lead to victory. Joffre's operational plan? Charles asked. Gallieri nodded slightly. Currently, only the army group commander knows about this plan. This explained why Charles hadn't participated. But this was merely an excuse Gallieri made for Charles. Most people, including Foch, wanted Charles involved. Foch bluntly stated at the meeting, "Charles knows how to defeat the Germans. I believe he should be the one to formulate the operational plan." But Carnes, on behalf of Joffre, refuted this. "I'm sorry, General Foch. This operational plan is more of a strategic direction, a plan for the entire army's offensive. We will place Charles and his troops in suitable offensive positions." The implication was that Charles's current rank and experience weren't yet sufficient to command an entire army. Foch muttered a complaint, "Unbelievable. We have Mars, yet we've sidelined him." Gallieri simply said nothing. He knew Joffre was trying to use this total operation to gain a more dazzling victory than Charles, taking advantage of Charles's recent defeat of the Germans and capture of hundreds of thousands. Therefore, Joffre couldn't possibly allow Charles to participate. Otherwise, this would just be another of Charles's battle plans, and Charles would win again, which would be meaningless to Joffre. Charles didn't care about that. He frowned and said, "Perhaps it's not the right time yet." "They don't think so," Gallieni said, sipping his coffee. "Your victory has greatly boosted the morale of the Allied forces. Many even think we can completely drive the Germans out of France within 2 months. The Germans, on the other hand, are demoralized because of the defeat in Belgium. More importantly," Gallieni put down his coffee cup and looked up at Charles, "Romania is going to join the Allies." "What?" Charles was surprised again. "Romania? Joining the Allies?" Gallieni nodded. "This happened after your victory in Antwerp. I guess their mentality is the same as Italy's. They think we are on the path to victory, and if they don't join the Allies now, they will miss the opportunity." The British played a role in this. They negotiated with the Romanians. The Romanians' conditions are simple: just recognize the status of Transylvania. Charles frowned. He remembered that Romania was not going to join until next year. It seemed to be happening earlier. Note: Romania joined the Entente powers in August 1916 and declared war on Austria-Hungary. Charles then understood what was happening. The Cambrai-Antwerp flanking maneuver was historically unprecedented, and the victory appeared to be a crushing defeat for the Germans, breaking through their lines and encircling 200,000 men in a single day, ultimately forcing over 100,000 to surrender. This fueled optimism about the war. Consequently, countries that had been wavering could no longer resist joining the Entente before the war ended to gain some advantage. Romania, and Italy. Gallieni turned and looked at the map on the wall behind him. And the British, French, and Russian Allied forces, launching attacks from several directions simultaneously. Joffre believed this was enough to crush Germany. "As long as we don't hesitate and firmly advance, victory is within reach." Gallieni's gaze remained fixed on the map, his tone calm. "You seem to disagree with this plan." "I don't disagree with the plan, General," Charles replied. "I disagree with Romania joining the Entente." Gallieni never expected Charles to answer like this. He turned sharply and looked at Charles with puzzlement. "Isn't having another ally a good thing? You may not know that Romania is Germany's main source of oil." Then Gallieni added, "Romania can also organize an army of over 500,000. "Exactly," Charles replied, word by word. "That's why I believe Romania shouldn't join, at least not now." If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 459: Forcing France to Fight a Positional War. The image below is a map of Romania during World War I. Transylvania was Austrian territory during the war but was later incorporated into Romania. The region was predominantly inhabited by Romanians but under Austro-Hungarian rule. This was the source of conflict between Romania and the Central Powers, and the main reason Romania joined the Entente. Oil, General, Charles analyzed. Oil is the lifeblood of the Germans. Once Romania declares its membership in the Entente, the Germans will not hesitate to attack and try to defeat it as quickly as possible. Gallieni paused, then nodded slightly. Before this, everyone, including Gallieni himself, believed that Romania's membership, given its oil-rich status, would be beneficial to the Entente. But Charles's explanation suggested that if Romania declared its membership, the Germans would conquer Romania and control its oil. Charles continued his analysis of the map. If Romania were a neutral country, Germany wouldn't have taken any extreme measures to secure its cooperation. In that case, Germany wouldn't actually get much oil, because Romania would also be selling oil to the Allied powers. Galini chimed in, but if the Germans control Romania, they'll get all the oil, while we'll get nothing. Yes, Charles nodded, so, it's better for Romania not to join than to join. The Germans have no reason to start a war, and they don't want to push her into the arms of the Allies. They can only watch helplessly as Romania cooperates with us. Galini gasped. This guy was right. Everyone, including Joffre, was on the wrong path without realizing it. But then, Galini asked again, but Romania can muster an army of 500,000, with the support of other forces. Look at Romania's position, General. Charles gestured with his chin towards the map. She's practically surrounded by the Central Powers. In the event of war, we can't provide reinforcements, except to Russia. The map above shows Romania's location, although it forms an encirclement of Germany and Austria with France, Britain, Italy, and Russia. Romania is effectively isolated. Galini stared at the map for a moment, then sighed softly. Russia is suffering defeats and is preoccupied with its own problems, making it difficult to spare troops to reinforce Romania. Charles added, even if they could, it wouldn't be of much use. Galini hesitated, then had to admit it. The Russian army was disorganized and ineffective. Even if they could reinforce, it wouldn't change anything. It would just be sending a bunch of prisoners to the German and Austrian armies. As for the Romanian army, although it numbered 500,000, they had almost never seen combat and were poorly trained. It wasn't hard to imagine what they would be like under a German attack. Galini frowned and sighed. The Allied approach seems to have secured a rare ally, but in reality, it's handing Romanian oil over to the Germans. They plan to have Romania declare war before the final offensive. Is that right? Charles asked. Yes, Galini nodded. There's still time, Charles said. Galini's expression tightened slightly. There's time, but not much, and besides, a hint of worry flashed in his eyes. I'm not sure if I can persuade them. Charles understood. This was part of Joffre's plan to defeat Charles, and he wouldn't easily give up this opportunity for a great victory. Before leaving, Galini instructed Charles, you don't know, understand? You know nothing. Yes, General, Charles replied. This was a military secret at the Army Group Commander level. Galini's discussion with Charles was already a violation of regulations. However, Galini didn't care about that. He secretly rejoiced that he had violated regulations by discussing it with Charles. Otherwise, there might have been serious problems. At the Palace of Sorrows in Potsdam, a suburb of Berlin, Wilhelm II and Falkenhayn strolled along the steps of a vineyard, admiring the heavy fruit hanging from the vines and discussing the current situation. The above image shows the Palace of Sorrows, a palace built in Potsdam by King Frederick II of Prussia in 1744. The above image shows the vineyards within the Palace of Sorrows. Fountains and statues lined the path, surrounded by lush greenery and clusters of grapes, creating a serene and elegant atmosphere. However, Wilhelm I's brow was furrowed, his hands behind his back bent, and his steps heavy. We seem to be surrounded by the enemy, Eric, Wilhelm I said with a hint of desolation, the war turning against the Central Powers. I've heard that the Romanians have recently been in contact with the British, seemingly considering joining the Entente. Falkenhayn grunted in agreement. Transylvania is the crux of the matter, unless we are willing to cede it to Romania. This was merely a casual remark. The key point is that Transylvania is not German territory but Austro-Hungarian territory. Forcibly ceding Transylvania would only alienate Austria-Hungary, and besides, that's not how the Germans handle problems. Is this the only solution you can think of? Wilhelm I chuckled, his tone tinged with displeasure. No, Your Majesty, Falkenhayn replied, calmly analyzing, I think it's unlikely we can completely defeat the British, because they have a powerful navy on the other side of the channel. Landing and occupying the island is an impossible task. Wilhelm I exhaled a cold breath, expressing his disdain. Wasn't it obvious? Falkenhayn continued, Russia can also be considered, because the Tsarist Russian army has been repeatedly defeated by us, and with a victory in the Dardanelles, Russia's defeat is only a matter of time. Wilhelm I gave a weak which could barely be considered good news. Italy can be disregarded. A hint of disdain flashed in Falkenhayn's eyes. They are easily defeated. The Austro-Hungarian army is more than capable of holding them off. What are you trying to say? Wilhelm I asked impatiently. Are you telling me we don't need to worry about their encirclement? But all of this insignificance combined might be enough to break us, General. What I'm saying is, Falkenhayn replied, our best course of action is to concentrate all our forces to eliminate our arch-enemy, France. You're insane, Wilhelm I looked at Falkenhayn in astonishment. France has Charles, he just defeated us and captured over 100,000 men. I know, Your Majesty. Falkenhayn stopped and turned to Wilhelm I. But I believe Charles is better suited to mobile warfare. What if we could force France into positional warfare? Wilhelm I hesitated, then nodded slightly. This might be a viable option. Chapter 460 How could such a thing happen? Ghent train station. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning coal. Passengers weaved through the crowds, some queuing for tickets, others dragging heavy luggage. Men, women, and children were all there, their faces etched with the excitement and anticipation of returning home. Some even raised their hands in triumph as soon as they stepped off the train. These were people who had fled Ghent before the German occupation. They thought they might never return to their hometowns, but one day they opened their eyes to the news that the Germans had surrendered and that Charles had reclaimed the land. And so, they could return to the place they had longed for. The image above shows Ghent train station, the third largest train station in Belgium. Lucia laboriously carried her suitcase out of the train station. She stood wearily at the entrance for a moment, then closed her eyes slightly, took a deep breath, and a smile of anticipation appeared on her face. She then quickened her pace unconsciously towards the taxi waiting at the entrance. Lucia had taken leave to return home. The journey of over 300 kilometers, though not far, took more than 10 hours for a poor person who could only afford to travel by train. Even so, Lucia had decided to make the trip. After all, she and her family were fortunate to be reunited and alive on Belgian soil as Belgians again. The taxi stopped on Wildestre Street, and Lucia got out with her suitcase. Before she could even stand properly, several people rushed out of a Gothic-style house by the roadside with exclamations. Lucia excitedly hugged them, tears streaming down her face, repeatedly calling out, "Mom, Dad, it's so good to see you. And Stein, you've grown up." As usual, Lucia reached out to affectionately pat her younger brother's head, but Stein blocked her hand. "Hey, Lucia," Stein protested, "like you said, I'm all grown up now, not a child anymore." Lucia looked confused. "But you're only 17, Stein." "Ignore him," Mrs. Gerard said, wiping away tears of joy, explaining as she led Lucia into the house. "He's obsessed with Charles now, only thinking about taking Charles as his role model." Lucia's steps faltered involuntarily. Mrs. Gerard asked, "What's wrong?" No, nothing." Lucia realized her lapse in composure and quickly forced a smile. "Charles is a very good role model." Stein instantly became excited. "See, Lucia supports me too." Mr. Gerard, carrying Lucia's luggage from behind, interrupted Stein. "Charles is indeed a very good role model, no one denies that. But I didn't ask you to lie about your age to enlist." Lucia turned to Stein in surprise. "You lied about your age to enlist? Are you crazy? Charles enlisted at 17, Stein retorted. "He's only 18 now, but he's already a brigadier general." "But he's a genius, Stein," Lucia said. "You can't expect to be like him." Stein interrupted Lucia without hesitation. "How will I know I'm not a genius if I don't try?" Lucia was speechless and looked to her mother for help. Mrs. Gerard shrugged. She had told him off several times, but still couldn't do anything about it. Once inside, Lucia and Mr. Gerard quickly formed a united front against the stubborn Stein. Mrs. Gerard went out to buy groceries, intending to cook Lucia's favorite pan-fried sole. Although her wallet was tight, Mrs. Gerard considered it a day worth celebrating. Returning with her basket, she encountered her neighbor, Mrs. Felix, also carrying a basket. "Mrs. Gerard," Mrs. Felix greeted her with a smile and a respectful bow. This surprised Mrs. Gerard. They usually had some disagreements and disliked each other, yet today she was unexpectedly showing such courtesy. Mrs. Gerard snorted, not intending to acknowledge her. It must be an act. Mrs. Felix seemed to spot the fish in Mrs. Gerard's basket and followed a few steps behind, asking solicitously, "Any extra dishes today, Mrs. Gerard?" Not wanting to offend someone so friendly, Mrs. Gerard could only nod. "Yes." Lucia's back. She thought this would get rid of her, but Mrs. Felix exclaimed in surprise, "Good heavens, Lucia's back. And Charles? Did he come along too?" "What?" Mrs. Gerard stopped, looking at Mrs. Felix in confusion. "Charles? Why would Charles come along? Are you joking?" no, of course not, Mrs. Felix said with a forced smile. It's a misunderstanding, Mrs. Gerard. I just thought Charles would. Then Mrs. Felix suddenly realized something. You don't know? God, I was too talkative. I'm sorry, so sorry, Mrs. Gerard. With that, Mrs. Felix turned and walked away. Mrs. Gerard wasn't about to let her off the hook. She quickly caught up and blocked her path, demanding, What do you mean I don't know? Or are you planning some kind of trick? No, Mrs. Felix stammered, flustered. Please forgive me, Mrs. Gerard. I hope you can forgive my previous rudeness. I truly mean it. Mrs. Gerard grew even more suspicious. She scrutinized Mrs. Felix, concluding that she didn't seem to be faking it, especially since tears were almost welling up in her eyes, and there was a hint of fear in them. Madame Gerard hesitated for a moment, then said, Unless you tell me the reason, Madame Felix, I will not forgive you. Really? Madame Felix's eyes lit up. You really want to forgive me? Madame Gerard nodded firmly. Of course, I keep my word. Madame Felix breathed a sigh of relief, her whole body relaxing. Then, she hesitated and said, This might be a secret, madam. I'm not sure if I can tell you, but, looking into Madame Gerard's determined eyes, Madame Felix could only muster her courage to answer, It's Lucia. She's Charles's girlfriend, and they're seeing each other. Madame Gerard was stunned, then laughed. Are you crazy? Charles and Lucia are seeing each other? God, you must be playing a trick on me again. It's true, madam, Madame Felix quickly declared. Protus returned yesterday. He's also working in Paris. He said everyone in Paris knows, and he's proud of Lucia. Mrs. Gerard's smile gradually froze on her face. She recalled the strange expression and subconscious movements on Lucia's face when Charles was mentioned earlier, and she slowly began to believe it was true. God, how could this happen? Mrs. Gerard's mind went blank for a few seconds, then she ran home like a mad woman. Chapter 461 So, this is true? At that moment, Lucia and Mr. Gerard were berating Stein. He even has a revolver, Mr. Gerard said, his eyes fixed on Stein. We don't know where he's hiding it. We saw him fiddling with it in the backyard one day. God, Stein. Lucia stared at her brother, wide-eyed. Where did you get that gun? I bought it with my own savings, Stein replied. It didn't cost the family a penny. He earned it from selling newspapers, Mr. Gerard explained angrily. We thought he was going to supplement the family income, but it turned out he used it to buy a gun. You should hand it over. It's too dangerous, Lucia said, her eyes filled with worry. He wasn't old enough to handle a gun, and more importantly, no one had taught him how to use it properly. No, Stein replied firmly. I need a weapon to protect myself and to protect this family. Lucia rolled her eyes in exasperation. She didn't know what to say. Fortunately, the Germans didn't find Stein's gun when they occupied the area, otherwise the whole family would have been implicated. The Germans would have assumed they were all Allied spies, and Lucia's spy identity would have been exposed. Lucia gritted her teeth, walked towards Stein with a stern face, and stared at him fiercely with a threatening look. You must hand it over. No, Stein refused without hesitation. The Germans have surrendered. Lucia found a good excuse. It's safe here now. You don't need that gun anymore. But Belgium hasn't been recovered yet. Stein puffed out his chest. We've only recovered a third of it, but that's none of your business. That's everyone's business, at least until you're 18, but by then, Charles might have already recovered all of Belgium, and the war might even be over. Just as the two were arguing, Mrs. Gerard appeared in the doorway, panting, Lucia, wait a minute, Mom, we have to make Stein hand over the gun today. Lucia glared angrily at her brother. They're telling the truth. Gerard gasped, whether from running too fast or from excitement, it was hard to tell. You're Charles's girlfriend, you're dating. The noisy room fell silent instantly. Mr. Gerard, busy grinding coffee beans, looked at Mrs. Gerard in shock, then turned his questioning gaze to Lucia. Lucia immediately realized she'd been exposed, and hesitantly replied, I was planning to tell you at dinner. Clang. Mr. Gerard lost his balance and tripped, the grinder shattering, coffee grounds spilling everywhere, instantly filling the room with the aroma of coffee. Lucia quickly helped Mr. Gerard up. No, I'm alright, Mr. Gerard said, shakily getting to his feet. Stein stared blankly at Madame Gerard, then at Lucia, and then laughed. I know, this is all a show you put on, to get me to hand over my gun? A very good idea. Madame Gerard's voice trembled with excitement. So, It's true, Lucia nodded gently, her heart conflicted. Was it real or fake? Madame Gerard excitedly stepped forward and hugged Lucia. God, I'm so happy for you, child. This is wonderful. I can't believe it's real. It's like a dream. You know what? I saw Charles that day. He was in the square, accepting the surrender. Mr. Gerard dusted off his trousers, straightened his back, his eyes shining with pride. I saw him too. He took the sword from the Germans and even addressed them. Those Germans didn't utter a sound in his presence. They were overjoyed because of Charles's promise of preferential treatment. He's a very good man, a genius commander. For some reason, Lucia felt like crying when she heard this, tears welling up in her eyes. Stein was starting to believe it. His expression was complex, shifting between joy and doubt, excitement and worry. After a moment's thought, Stein suddenly exclaimed, "Then what are we waiting for? We should go to Antwerp." "Charles is there." "No, Stein," Lucia quickly objected. "He's busy. He's commanding the army in battle. I shouldn't disturb him." "Yes," Mr. Gerard agreed, "he's doing what a man should do." "But Lucia is already here," Stein countered. "It's only 59 kilometers from here. If Lucia is Charles's girlfriend, should she go see him?" Mr. and Mrs. Gerard exchanged glances. Stein's words seemed reasonable. Charles could refuse if he was busy, but if Lucia was already in Ghent and didn't go to see Charles, did it mean she didn't care about him? Lucia didn't really want to go, because it was all a lie. Charles didn't consider her his girlfriend at all she felt was bitterness and pain. But if she didn't go, wouldn't people suspect her as Charles' girlfriend? And wouldn't her identity as a spy be exposed? In Antwerp, Charles was organizing new training for armored and mechanized divisions. Tigeny looked at the training subjects with some confusion. Leap-forward tactics, urban warfare, trench filling. Tigeny couldn't stand it anymore. He put the documents on the table and looked up at Charles with a puzzled expression. "Isn't this what infantry should be doing? It looks like trench warfare. I don't think armored and mechanized units should have such tasks." Tigeny believed that following the infantry was too valuable. They knew how to coordinate with tanks and should follow tanks to break through enemy lines on the battlefield. These high-casualty trench warfare tasks should be left to ordinary infantry. Charles calmly replied, "If it were before, perhaps that would be true." "What do you mean?" Tigeny didn't understand. "There are anti-tank ditches in front of the enemy's lines, General." Charles stretched his aching neck. "Tanks can't cross the anti-tank ditches. There's only one solution. Soldiers clear the obstacles and fill the ditches in front of the tanks, but we can still use ordinary infantry for this," Tigeny objected. "They are experts in trench warfare." Actually, Tigeny didn't want to waste his troops attacking enemy trenches. Charles's words left Tigeny speechless. "Ordinary infantry won't coordinate with tanks, General." Tigeny seemed to understand Charles's meaning. "The cover between infantry and tanks is mutual. If the infantry is blocked, the tanks need to lead the way, and the infantry provide cover behind the tanks. Sometimes the tanks are blocked, and the infantry need to lead the way, and the tanks provide suppressive fire behind the infantry. If ordinary infantry were sent in, it would inevitably lead to a stalemate in trench warfare." Tigeny was overjoyed and quickly pulled out his notebook, sitting down at his desk to jot down this new insight. Just then, a guard rushed in and reported to Charles, "Brigadier General, Lucia is here." "She's outside, Lucia." Charles was puzzled. What was she doing here? Did she have important intelligence? Chapter 462 Charles's girlfriend is Belgian. The Lucia family's journey to Antwerp was quite an ordeal. They arrived at the train station, only to be politely told by the ticket seller, "I'm sorry, sir. The latest train to Antwerp isn't until tomorrow morning." "Why?" Mr. Gerard asked, puzzled. "I remember there used to be many trains. It was only 59 kilometers to Antwerp." "There are only 2 now, sir," the ticket seller replied. "You just missed the last one for today." "Only 2? Mr. Gerard was stunned. The ticket seller explained, "Antwerp is the front line, sir. Charles is organizing a defensive line there, and we must ensure military supplies reach the soldiers first. Therefore, all other trains have been converted to transport supplies." Mr. Gerard was speechless. He looked back at the others, who also seemed resigned. This was to be expected. Military supplies had to be prioritized during wartime. After a moment of silence, Mr. Gerard gritted his teeth. "Let's call a taxi." "But taxis aren't cheap these days, Dad," Lucia said, backing down. "I should still go." Gerard walked out of the train station without looking back. Several taxis were parked outside the train station. Gerard approached and asked the price, her face instantly changing. This is impossible. It used to cost only around 100 francs, now it's 500 francs. The image above shows the Belgian franc, issued in 1851 and replaced by the euro in 2002. Mrs. Gerard followed, and after understanding the situation, asked the driver in bewilderment, "The Germans have surrendered, why is it more expensive than before?" 5 times more expensive. Stein glared angrily at the driver. Capitalists must be taking this opportunity to make a fortune. Head. The taxi driver looked at Stein with dissatisfaction. "We're not exactly capitalists, son. We just earn a meager profit to support our families. The reason it's so expensive is because during the war, all the country's fuel was collected for the Charlemagne troops. Even now, the fuel we can get is still pitifully scarce and incredibly expensive, because we still need to ensure the Charlemagne tanks and armored vehicles are operational, as well as military vehicles, etc. You have a problem with this." The others exchanged glances. It was understandable. Lucia sighed inwardly. Why did everything have to do with Charles? He was like a persistent nightmare, a shadow that, though not physically present, was always there. "I don't have that much money," Mr. Gerard said, looking at Lucia with a troubled expression. "I only have 270 francs, that's all our savings." "Then we'll wait until tomorrow to take the train, Dad," Lucia comforted him. Gerard nodded, seemingly resigned to the situation. Just then, someone called out from behind, "Hey, Lucia, it's Lucia." It was a stylish blonde woman, carrying a small suitcase in one hand and a trench coat draped over her other. "Rost," Lucia recognized her too, greeting her with surprise and delight, and hugging her. She was Lucia's junior high school classmate, whom she hadn't seen for many years. "Where are you going?" Rost glanced at the taxi next to them. "We were planning to go to Antwerp, but," Rost instantly understood, "to see Charles?" "Right," Lucia gave a wry smile. More people knew about this than he had imagined, even Rost knew. But this didn't seem surprising. If even one classmate knew, it would soon spread to all the classmates or acquaintances they could contact. The reason was that Charles was too famous. Especially in Belgium, this guy was practically a savior. Rost glanced around, seemingly guessing what had happened. She politely greeted Mr. Gerard and Girardov, then took out some money and handed it to the driver. "Antwerp, keep the change." As the driver took the money, Rost tilted her head and smiled, saying, "You're lucky, sir, that's Charles's girlfriend standing there." The driver's eyes widened instantly, his hand holding the money frozen in midair. He looked at Lucia, then back at Rost. "No, this can't be." Rost nodded slightly, expressionless. "Would anyone dare joke about this? That's Charles." "And why didn't you ask their destination?" Stein took a small step forward, puffed out his chest proudly, and said, "We're going to Antwerp Airport, sir. General Charles should be there." The driver hesitated for a moment, then quickly pushed Rost's money back and jumped out of the car. He walked respectfully to Lucia, eagerly taking her luggage and placing it in the car. "Excuse me, madam, it's a pleasure to serve you. I promise to get you safely to Antwerp." No, I'll wait for you to come back together. It's not easy to find a car in Antwerp, it's the front line, and even if there are cars, there's no gas." No, it's free." "It's my pleasure," he muttered afterward. "God, Charles's girlfriend, she's in my car. Unbelievable." At Antwerp Airport, the taxi slowed down and finally stopped at the airport entrance. Stein jumped out before the car had even come to a complete stop, almost tripping amidst Mrs. Gilead's exclamations and scolding. But he didn't care, tilting his head back to shield his eyes from the sun as he strained to see the fighter jets taking off from the airport, letting out a "Wow, that's a camel, that's a camel fighter jet," Stein shouted to the crowd, gesturing towards the sky. "That's a fighter jet invented by Charles. It has no rivals in the air, German planes are no match for it." Mr. Gerard grunted, straightened his suit after getting out of the car, frowned, and glared at Stein. This country bumpkin, wasn't he worried about embarrassing himself in front of Charles? The moment Lucia stepped out of the car, the guard standing at the door recognized her and immediately stepped forward to ask, "Lucia, are you here to see the general?" Lucia nodded. "Wait a moment," the guard said, "I'll report to the general." "Okay," Lucia said, "thank you." With just a few simple words, her relatives, friends, and driver all looked at Lucia with admiration. Mr. Gerard nodded slightly with satisfaction, his eyes brimming with pride. Mrs. Gerard was so excited that she covered her mouth, almost crying out. Her chest heaved as if she couldn't breathe. Stein swallowed hard, staring blankly at his sister, seemingly trying to figure out how to please her. Although they had believed Lucia's words before, they still couldn't believe it was true. It seemed too unreal. However, the guard's reaction confirmed it. The driver, too, had been vaguely worried he'd been fooled, but now it all seemed real. This woman named Lucia was indeed Charles's girlfriend. God, Charles's girlfriend is Belgian. The driver shook his head incredulously. Tomorrow, everyone will go crazy for this. I'm going to be a star. Chapter 463 1 in 700. Lucia was filled with anxiety, unsure if Charles would welcome her. He might refuse outright. After all, it was wartime. He had countless matters to attend to, and it concerned the life and death of Belgium. Or perhaps he chose to meet her but acted coldly, because he was thinking of the lady in white and the intelligence. Lucia glanced around, seeing the joy or hope in their eyes, and couldn't help but regret bringing them along. She should have firmly refused, or come alone, so as not to embarrass herself in front of her family or disappoint them. Charles was also pondering similar questions as he walked out of the command post and downstairs. How should he face Lucia? Should he simply ask if she had intelligence and then tell her to leave? That would be too abrupt, not like a couple at all. What should a couple be like? Charles slowed his pace. Reuniting with his girlfriend after so long was certainly a surprise, so it should be. Charles gradually quickened his pace, and soon he was running. Reaching the door, he saw Lucia from afar and excitedly called out, running forward to hug her tightly, spinning her around slightly, and then without hesitation, kissing her passionate lips. That's how it's done in the movies. To Charles's surprise, Lucia seemed somewhat resistant. She gently nudged Charles and whispered in his ear, "There are people here." Charles was startled, only then realizing that several people beside him were staring blankly at him. They seemed to have come with Lucia. Lucia straightened her dress and introduced them to Charles in a low voice. "This is my father, mother, and younger brother." This caught Charles off guard. He glanced at Lucia in a flustered manner. "Meeting the parents? This wasn't part of the task I gave you." Mr. Gerard nervously rubbed his hands together. He stepped forward and shook hands with Charles, saying, "It's an honor to meet you, General." "My name is Gerard." "It's an honor, Mr. Gerard," Charles replied. Lady Gerard stepped forward with a smile, her eyes looking at Charles as if she had found a treasure. "Hello, General, I am Lucia's mother." "Hello, Lady Gerard." The usually lively Stein froze on the spot, only snapping out of his daze when Lucia nudged him. He hurriedly stepped forward and grasped Charles's hands with both of his. "General, His hands trembled and his teeth chattered, and he couldn't manage to utter a single word for a long time. "His name is Stein." Lucia rolled her eyes. "He just said he wanted to join the army and fight the Germans, but now he's acting like a coward." Charles smiled at Stein. "That's because I'm not German. I believe he'll be a warrior when facing the enemy." "Yes, General," Stein nodded gratefully. "I promise." Lucia glared at Charles and whispered, "He's only 17. "Oh." Charles immediately realized a problem and turned to Stein. "Then you should get in shape and prepare to await the country's call." There was some disappointment in Stein's eyes, but he still stepped forward and answered, "Yes, General." Mr. and Mrs. Gerard were incredulous. When did Stein become so agreeable? Lucia, however, understood. It wasn't that he was agreeable at all. Stein was taking Charles's words as an order. Entering the airport, Stein was once again stunned by the rows of fighter planes parked there, his mouth agape. He had never seen the Camel fighter so close before. It was the most advanced fighter plane of the Allied powers. And Belgium didn't have a single one. He could only look on with envy. Charles led everyone into the reception room on the first floor. According to regulations, civilians were not allowed to enter the command center. Many things could be leaked with just a glance, such as operational maps. The reception room had 2 sofas and a coffee table. The orderly, Adrian, brought everyone some cakes and fruit, and also made several cups of hot coffee. Mrs. Gerard's eyes were fixed on Charles, smiling, making Charles feel somewhat uncomfortable. "Excuse me, General," Mr. Gerard said. "We didn't mean to bother you, but Lucia happened to be visiting us in Ghent, so." Charles glanced at Lucia sitting beside him in surprise. "You're from Ghent?" Lucia took a sip of her coffee. Back then, Belgium was still in German hands. "Where I'm from isn't important." Then she glanced at Charles and said half-jokingly, "No one will know you took Antwerp in just one day, General." Otherwise, I would have asked you to take care of my family." Everyone burst into laughter. Mr. Gerard nodded secretly. It seemed Lucia and Charles got along well. Charles once again marveled at Lucia's acting skills and her clever social abilities. She always managed to turn awkward situations into pleasant ones. "There's something I need your help with," Lucia made a request. "What?" Charles asked. His first thought was of cars, houses, bank deposits, and exorbitant dowries, things that were usually discussed when meeting the parents. But foreigners didn't seem to need those things. Lucia nodded toward Stein, who was sitting opposite him. "He has a revolver, Lucia." Stein stood up to protest Lucia's betrayal. But Charles glanced at him, and Stein immediately shrank back down. Charles stood up and beckoned to Stein. "We're about the same age, Stein, and we're both interested in the military. We should have something in common." "Yes, General," Stein followed respectfully. Charles led him to the window, gazing at the fighter jets taking off outside. "Do you know what kind of people we need most?" he asked. Stein shook his head blankly. "I don't know, General." Charles gestured towards the roaring engines of the fighters soaring into the sky. "Pilots, Stein. We currently only have a little over 700 pilots capable of combat missions, and that's with the Germans suffering almost no losses before their fighters developed. Can you imagine? We have millions of soldiers, yet only 700 pilots. Once the Germans develop new fighters capable of confronting us, pilots will become extremely scarce. Do you want to be 1 in a million, or 1 in 700? Stein's eyes lit up, his chest heaving. You mean, I can become a pilot?" "Why not?" Charles replied. "We need anyone from the Allied powers who can fly." Stein straightened up and answered, "I understand, General. I want to be 1 in 700. "Very good." Charles nodded, turning his gaze to Stein. "If you want to be 1 in 700, what you need to learn now isn't revolvers, but the principles of flight and related knowledge. Do you understand what I mean?" "Understood." Stein straightened up again. "I'll hand over the pistol as soon as I get back." Mrs. Gerard glanced at Charles and Stein by the window, patting Lucia's hand with a look of satisfaction. "He's excellent, not just in war." "Yes," Lucia replied, lowering his head to drink his coffee to hide the dejection in his eyes. Chapter 464 Gallieri's old injury relapses. Charles ultimately received only a piece of information that was of little use. The considerate Mr. Gerard, along with the others, had said goodbye to Charles and waited for him outside the airport, intentionally creating an opportunity for Charles and Lucia to be alone. "I'm sorry," Lucia said, "news about our relationship has reached Belgium." "So, I know." Charles nodded, he had already guessed. Then Charles asked, "Did I disappoint them?" Lucia smiled, holding his coffee cup. "What do you think?" Charles didn't need to do anything, his aura was enough to win over any parent, especially since his behavior was quite appropriate. However, Charles didn't seem to care about that. He immediately changed the subject. "Nothing happened in Paris, right?" Lucia thought for a moment and replied, "People are furious about Gravey's betrayal, especially knowing he was targeting you, so they plan to send him to the guillotine next week." Charles didn't react, he already had the information. Gravey had only himself to blame. This idealistic stubborn man could only avoid becoming a problem for Charles by being sent to the guillotine. Lucia continued, "Armand was acquitted, and some speculate that the Second Bureau arrested Gravey based on his tip." Charles nodded expressionlessly. The truth was different. Charles had Lieutenant Colonel Fernand, sent by Garlini, reach an agreement with Armand, help Charles build momentum on the right wing, or face execution along with Gravey as a spy. Any intelligent person would accept this condition. Lucia put down her coffee, glanced at Charles, and hesitantly asked, "You don't have anything else to say?" Charles stared blankly at Lucia, thought for a moment, then suddenly said, "Oh, understanding." He moved closer to Lucia, both feeling each other's breath. Lucia's heart raced instantly, both surprised and delighted, thinking to herself that this guy had finally gotten it. Unexpectedly, Charles lowered his voice and said, "The intelligence you provided about Belgium is very accurate, and the guerrillas you contacted played a significant role in this campaign. Your contributions are part of the success of this campaign. Next, the focus of intelligence should shift to enemy-occupied areas, especially the Leuven and Namur fortress lines." Lucia felt a chill run down her spine, her eyes filled with disappointment, but she still silently replied, "Yes, General." Lucia forced a smile the whole way, patiently dealing with her family's curiosity and inquiries until she returned to Ghent, entered her room, and closed the door. Only then did tears of grievance finally fall. She sat on the bed for a while, lost in thought, beginning to regret accepting this mission. She had thought being Charles's girlfriend would be easy, but who knew it would be such torture? If she could, she would rather apply for a transfer. But Lucia knew this was unrealistic. A transfer only meant two things: Charles dumping her, or her dumping Charles. But neither seemed normal. Both could expose Lucia's identity and even endanger the lady in white. Lucia found herself in a bind. Whether she liked it or not, she had to play the role. "Lucia," came her mother's voice from downstairs. "Relatives and friends are here to see you." Lucia quickly got up and glanced at herself in the mirror. Her eyes were a little red and swollen. This might give her away, and besides, she had neither the energy nor the inclination to deal with them. Thinking this, Lucia feigned a weak voice and replied, "I'm tired, Mom. I want to rest for a while." "Okay," her mother replied helplessly. Lucia changed into her pajamas and hid under the covers, continuing to resent Charles. She wanted nothing more than to give this dull-witted guy a good whack on the head. Just then, her mother knocked softly on the door. "Lucia? The mayor wants to see you. He said he'd like to invite us to dinner tonight." Lucia hesitated for a moment, then turned to face the door and replied, "Mom, I only took 2 days off. I'm going back to Paris tomorrow." "Okay." Her mother hesitated for a moment. "I'll decline for you." After a while, the knocking started again. Lucia was on the verge of a breakdown. She abruptly threw back the covers and poked her head out, her voice filled with resentment. "Mom, I just want to sleep. I don't want to see anyone. That damned Charles, it's all because of him. Those who want to see me are only doing so because I'm Charles's girlfriend. They have no idea how hard it is to play that role." "Lucia," came her mother's slightly panicked voice from outside the door, "it's His Majesty the King. He's downstairs, and he wishes to have dinner with us." Lucia sat bolt upright, her face filled with disbelief. "His Majesty the King? Albert I? Downstairs? Okay." Then Lucia realized that although His Majesty the King held a supreme position in Belgium, Charles was far more important internationally than Albert I. It was all because of that bastard again. Why couldn't she escape his shadow no matter where she went? Antwerp Airport, afternoon. Charles and Tidjane agreed that they could reduce the frequency of fighter jet takeoffs. "We shut down a total of 39 German reconnaissance planes," Tidjane said. "None of them were fighters." He then quipped triumphantly, "The Germans are terrified of our camel. They can't compare to it in either speed or maneuverability." This was thanks to the camel's design. It was the idea of the team Charles poached from the British Automobile Company, who concentrated all the heavy loads, engine, pilot, fuel tanks, and weapons, near the aircraft's center of gravity. This created an additional torque when the aircraft turned in the air, resulting in a smaller turning radius. Combined with the engine's high thrust and greater speed, the Camel could complete 3 turns while the German Fokker E1 had only completed 2. This significant advantage allowed the Camel to easily keep up with the Fokker E1, even when it had run out of ammunition, leaving the enemy helpless. "We can't let our guard down." Charles marked the spot on the map where the enemy reconnaissance plane had been shot down. "The Germans were likely just testing the range of our fighter planes. It seems they have some kind of plan." Tidjane was startled, then nodded slightly, his expression turning serious. Sacrificing a reconnaissance plane to test the range of our fighter planes was clearly a prelude to the transport of supplies, or the advance of artillery, or the development of an operational plan outside the Camel fighter plane's control zone. "Brigadier General," the communications officer exclaimed. "General Gerlini is in the hospital." "What?" Charles looked up sharply, his eyes slightly panicked. "What happened?" "It's said he had a dispute with Commander-in-Chief, Joffre," the communications officer replied. The general was so angry that his old injury flared up and he collapsed in the car. Charles's face turned cold. He knew why. Gerlini had tried to persuade Joffre to delay Romania's accession to the Entente. Chapter 465 Ziafai is doomed. A heated argument is taking place in the conference room of the French General Staff headquarters in Lagden. "We cannot let Romania join the Entente, Your Excellency Commander-in-Chief." Gerlini stared at Joffre. "I believe it is more advantageous for us to keep it neutral." "Is that so?" Joffre was skeptical. "How so? Is it continuing to sell oil to the Germans? Or grain, coal, or even weapons and ammunition?" The image above shows Romanian soldiers carrying Mannlicher rifles. Mannlicher rifles were produced in Austria and were the same type used by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, thus providing them with munitions during the war. "Indeed," Gerlini said. But it's far better than all of Romania being under German control. Have you considered what it would be like if the Germans controlled all of Romania? Think of all the oil, grain, and the arsenals that the Austro-Hungarian Empire could directly utilize. I mean all of them. Joffre laughed, a sneer playing on his lips, and retorted, then have you considered what would happen if our plan succeeded? The war would be over, General. That's a siege by over 3 million troops from more than a dozen countries. You should be praying for the Germans, not thinking they will occupy Romania. Note, Joffre included the forces of Britain, France, Russia, Italy, Romania, and the colonial army. Gallieni insisted on his idea. Look at the map, Commander-in-Chief. Your so-called siege is actually underway, but apart from Charles, there has been no breakthrough in other directions. In some places, they are even in retreat, yet you are hoping that Romania's involvement will change things. Gallieni was also awakened by Charles. Joffre's encirclement plan seemed grand on the surface, with more than 3 million troops from more than a dozen countries simultaneously exerting their strength. Almost no force on earth could withstand it. However, the vast majority of these troops were locked in a stalemate with the enemy in the trenches. Not only the main British and French forces, but also Italy's million-strong army made no progress, and the Russian army was in retreat. If Romania's 500,000 troops joined, and the other countries launched a counterattack simultaneously, could they really defeat the German army? Wasn't that too idealistic? But Joffre obviously wouldn't admit it. Your idea is utterly ridiculous. Joffre tapped his finger heavily on the table, his eyes filled with disdain. We discussed this at the last meeting, and you didn't object then. A simultaneous counteroffensive and fighting separately are different. The former obviously puts more pressure on the Germans, not to mention the addition of Romania. Then, Joffre suddenly seemed to realize something, and he leaned back in his chair with an "Oh, I understand, you don't want me to win." What? Gallieni didn't understand Joffre's meaning. Am I right? Joffre looked at Gallieni with a half-smile. It's Charles who wants to win, hence your current persuasion. Gallieni was stunned. He hadn't expected Joffre to have such an idea. Everything makes sense now, Joffre said with a look of sudden realization. I've always wondered why anyone would be unwilling to let an oil-producing country join us. Now the truth is clear. Gallieni glared angrily at Joffre, his voice hoarse. No, Commander-in-Chief, you are insulting my character. No, General. Joffre calmly shook his head. This has nothing to do with character. It's about interests. I understand. Then, before Gallieni could protest, Joffre raised his voice, speaking with righteous indignation. However, General Gallieni, don't forget you are a French lieutenant general. People privately call you the savior of Paris. Then, before considering your own or small group's interests, shouldn't you consider the interests of France first? Furthermore, I believe you should consider the common interests of the Allied powers first. That's what a soldier should do. This is our duty, and also an explanation to the citizens of France, to all those who sacrificed their lives. Gallieni trembled with rage. No, Commander-in-Chief. This is slander, baseless defamation. I refuse to accept it. Then, please explain a question, General, Joffre said, spreading his hands. How can we refuse the entry of such a crucial nation? He added, if you wish, I can put it on display at a conference. Or, we can publish it in the newspapers after the war and see whether the French people support you or me. Gallieni was stunned. Intuitively, allowing Romania to join the Entente was clearly the right thing to do. Even Gallieni himself had initially thought so. Joining was always better than not joining, that was common sense. Therefore, whether it was discussed at a conference or published in the newspapers for the people to decide, Joffre was right, not Gallieni. Gallieni realized he couldn't persuade Joffre, because Joffre had already concluded that Gallieni was sabotaging this operational plan that could end the war for Charles's sake. Gallieni gritted his teeth and said nothing more, simply saying, farewell, Commander-in-Chief. As Gallieni walked out of the conference room, he heard Joffre's contemptuous laughter behind him. Gallieni, pale-faced, returned to his car and headed back to Paris. He didn't say a word the whole way, only gritting his teeth and staring blankly at the empty space before him. At this moment, he was burdened by an insurmountable obstacle. Why was this happening? It was clearly Joffre who devised this unrealistic encirclement plan for personal gain, and Gallieni had merely pointed out its flaws, yet he was falsely accused of sabotaging the plan for personal benefit. What was even more infuriating was that he couldn't explain himself. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. It felt like a stone was pressing on his chest. as if something was blocking his breath. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his abdomen, and everything went black. Galleri slowly slumped onto the back seat of the car. The image above is of the Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, founded in 1613, originating from a charity hospital converted from an arsenal at the behest of King Louis XIV of France. Paris, 13th arrondissement, Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital. Galleri slowly opened his eyes and saw Charles expressionlessly peeling an apple with a fruit knife beside his bed. "Hey, Brigadier General," Galleri looked around in confusion, struggling to get up. "Where am I?" "In Antwerp. Don't move, General." Charles quickly stopped Galleri, replying, "This is Paris." "You're in the hospital." Galleri recalled the events, gradually remembering what had happened. He chuckled self-deprecatingly and shook his head slightly. "I failed to persuade Joffre." Charles cut the apple into small pieces and placed them on a plate, forking a piece and offering it to Galleri. "You don't need to worry about this. Leave it to me." "Leave it to you?" Galleri looked at Charles in confusion. This wasn't something he could get involved in. What could he do? However, when Galleri saw the coldness in Charles's eyes, he knew that wasn't the case. This young man had abandoned all restraint. He intended to deal with Joffre. Joffre was finished. No one could defeat him, not even Joffre. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 466 Battle of Verdun. At the Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital, it was afternoon. Gallieni's condition had finally stabilized. Perhaps due to exhaustion and the effects of medication, he drifted off to sleep in his hospital bed. Charles took this opportunity to find Gallieni's attending physician, Arthur, the hospital's best surgeon, who was nearly 60 years old. "The situation isn't good," Arthur said, pointing to the X-ray. "There are still several small pieces of shrapnel in his abdomen that haven't been removed. Some are barely visible to the naked eye. Surgery is needed." "But," Charles interrupted, "his physical condition might not be able to withstand the surgery." "Yes, General," Dr. Arthur said with regret. "That's why it's been delayed until now, so we can continue to delay." Charles asked again. "Indeed," Dr. Arthur nodded helplessly. "Unless absolutely necessary, surgery is not recommended. Try to avoid significant emotional fluctuations." Charles thanked him and, after leaving the hospital, walked alone down the corridor, silently lighting a cigarette. Wounded soldiers frequently saluted Charles from both sides, and beautiful nurses often cast alluring glances their way. They whispered amongst themselves, and some even deliberately passed by Charles. But Charles showed no reaction, as if isolated from the world, walking on his own. Historically, Galleri was driven to his death by Joffre. Galleri had just undergone surgery when Joffre was removed from his position as commander-in-chief by Parliament. Parliament had initially decided to dismiss Joffre outright. His performance on the battlefield was appalling, almost always leading the French army into German traps. However, Galleri still believed Joffre had some figurehead value and therefore suggested a demotion in name only, recommending that Joffre be appointed as a military advisor to the government and promoted to Marshal of France. Joffre, however, believed it was all a conspiracy by Galleri and angrily confronted him. Galleri died in May 1916. Charles walked slowly to the end of the corridor, watching the plane trees sway gently in the breeze outside the window, silently resolving that this time, such a thing must not happen again. At that moment, a communications soldier stood beside Charles and reported, "General, a telegram from headquarters says the Germans seem to be preparing for an attack. They are massing troops around Verdun." Charles was startled, took the telegram, and saw that it was indeed Verdun. Was the famous Battle of Verdun about to begin? It seemed to have come a little earlier than expected. Note, the Battle of Verdun historically began in February 1916, 6 months ago. Soon, Charles seemed to realize the reason. The Germans believed they could not match Charles's forces in mobile warfare and armored units, so they planned to attack a strategic location that the French army had to defend, thus changing their tactics. Verdun was this must-defend location, only 210 kilometers from Paris, a formidable fortress composed of more than 20 bunkers, essentially the gateway to Paris. If Verdun is not captured, the German army can only advance on Paris via the northern or southern front, which will inevitably encounter layers of resistance. However, If Verdun is captured, there will be almost no defensible terrain afterward, and German armored forces could potentially penetrate into Paris in just a few days, like Charles's troops. At that time, Paris will be in constant danger. Charles nodded, threw his unfinished cigarette on the ground and stomped it out fiercely, giving Joffre the opportunity to set a trap. The most ruthless blow to someone like Joffre, who is obsessed with fame and fortune, is to ruin his reputation, turning him from a pretty-faced into a spittoon despised by everyone. Charles turned back and gave an instruction to the guard standing in front of Gallieni's ward, then strode towards the hospital exit. The hospital was not far from the city defense headquarters, and in less than 20 minutes, Charles appeared in the dim light of the officers' club. The officers' club had just opened, and it was empty of officers. It wasn't until he entered that Charles suddenly remembered that Lucia might still be in Belgium with his family. But when he looked up, he was surprised to find Lucia busy behind the bar. "You're back?" Charles asked. Lucia, who was cleaning, was startled. When she looked up and saw Charles, a flicker of surprise crossed her eyes, and the weariness on her face vanished instantly. "Yes, General. I only took 2 days off, and I even had to switch shifts with Gerald to make it back." Then she asked Charles, "Why are you also?" Before she could finish, Lucia said, "Oh, is it because of General Gallieni?" This matter was supposed to be kept secret, but it happened so suddenly that many people saw it on the street, and it had spread before any action could be taken. "Yes," Charles nodded slightly and said, "A cup of coffee." Without waiting for Lucia's reply, he turned and walked to his usual seat. Watching Charles's back, Lucia felt a strange sense of fear. The person in front of her seemed somewhat different from the Charles she knew. Soon, a cup of coffee was placed in front of Charles, and Lucia also took one and sat down opposite him. "I'm so sorry," Lucia said with concern. "I just heard about this." "How is General Gallieni?" "He's fine," Charles replied expressionlessly. "He'll be all right," Lucia reassured her. "The Pitié Salpêtrière Hospital has the best doctors in the world." "Lucia," Charles interrupted her, leaning forward and whispering an order, "send a message to the British intelligence through your men. The Germans' target isn't Verdun, but Balfour." Balfour was another important city on the Western Front, 400 kilometers further from Paris, but its defenses were far inferior to Verdun's, which boasted over 20 fortresses and hundreds of fortified guns of various calibers. Lucia's heart sank. Yes, he didn't need her comforting words, he was there to give orders. His mind was only on the war and General Gallieni. "Yes, General," Lucia nodded, looking aggrieved. Charles, oblivious to Lucia's change in mood, added, "We can't let them discover your identities. This intelligence was found by the British themselves, and they analyzed it themselves." "Yes, General," Lucia replied. "Don't worry, the ladies in white are just ordinary people. They have their own jobs and are busy every day. The British won't find anything." Charles nodded in satisfaction. This was exactly what he wanted. The ladies in white's advantage lay in their covert operations, while the British intelligence agents were in the open. As long as the ladies in white slightly embellished and trimmed the intelligence, allowing the British intelligence agents to synthesize and analyze the information to reach their own conclusions, they would be completely convinced. If the British intelligence agents were completely convinced, Joffre would fall into this trap. Chapter 467. The fortress is outdated. Lagerdun, French General Staff Headquarters. This was Joffre's busiest period. After finalizing the battle plan, the immediate concern was supply. "General, the frontline troops are lacking supplies. Shells and bullets are insufficient to support a large-scale counter-offensive, especially artillery. We don't have enough large-caliber guns to engage the enemy. Our soldiers will suffer heavy casualties during the offensive. Not only ammunition, but soldier supplies are also severely lacking. Many units report not having boots. Their own canvas shoes cannot penetrate the enemy's barbed wire." The war had now lasted exactly 1 year. France was now facing another serious problem, a severe shortage of supplies and equipment, to the point that civilians were required to bring their own boots when conscripted. Note, the reason for the shortage of boots, not uniforms, is that while uniforms can be patched and reused after soldiers on the front lines have died, boots are consumed quickly and have strict length requirements, resulting in a lower reuse rate. Joffre coldly replied, "Then let them bring a pair of boots from home. Did they need boots before joining the army and becoming soldiers? Furthermore, prioritize the transport of ammunition. This is crucial. After victory, everything will be different. The war will be over." Joffre was an arrogant man. Once he made up his mind, nothing anyone said mattered. Galeri's earnest explanations failed to stir any ripples in Joffre's heart. He remained convinced of his ultimate victory. However, just as he confidently planned his great counter-offensive, a communications soldier approached and reported, "General, intelligence indicates that German troops are gathering around Verdun." Verdun? Joffre frowned, then located Verdun on the map. Joffre looked up at Carnegie. "I remember there were many well-defended fortresses there, wasn't there?" "Yes, General." Carnegie quickly flipped through the documents, something he hadn't prepared for. Fortunately, a staff officer found them in time and handed them the information. Carnegie read the documents with a sigh of relief. There are a total of 19 large fortresses and 7 small fortresses, each with more than 30 cannons, 155 mm, 120 mm, and 75 mm respectively. "My God," Joffre exclaimed, "our troops at the front have no cannons available, but Verdun has nearly 1,000 cannons? And they even have 155 mm and 120 mm calibers." The French army was desperately short of these two calibers, with only a few dozen in the entire army. "But those are," Carnes hurriedly replied, "they're fortress cannons, General. Without artillery, those fortresses are useless. And Verdun is the gateway to Paris. It's very important." Joffre stroked his chin, considered for a moment, and slowly said, "I know it's important, Carnes, but with such strong fortifications and so many cannons, why would the Germans attack Verdun? Don't you find that a bit strange?" Joffre's question made Carnes realize the logic. Normally, an attack should target the weakest point in the enemy's defenses, not their strongest fortifications, but the Germans were doing the opposite. "Perhaps it's because it's close to Paris," Carnes said. "The Germans might want to concentrate their forces to defeat our army, and attacking Paris would achieve that goal to some extent." Even so, Joffre's gaze swept across the defensive line, his finger pointing on the map. "They can still bypass Verdun." Carnes nodded in agreement. Verdun was simply the closest point to Paris. After a moment's thought, Joffre nodded. "Send Christine here." Christine was the only major general in Joffre's army to have commanded armored forces in battle and won, although that victory was achieved under Charles's guidance. His combat experience was unparalleled. Joffre believed that to keep tactics up to date, only generals like Christine, who had proven themselves on the battlefield, could do so, not staff officers like Carnes who remained in their offices. Soon, Christine stood before Joffre. Pointing to Verdun on the map, Joffre asked, "The enemy is gathering in front of Verdun. What are your thoughts?" Christine frowned, pondered for a moment, and said, "I'm not sure, General. But if it were me, I certainly wouldn't choose to attack here." "It's quite surprising," Joffre gave a satisfied hum, which coincided with his own thoughts. "However," Christine added, "but if the Germans attack here, I think they have their reasons." Joffre asked, "How so? Wasn't this a contradiction?" "Because they have large caliber cannons, General," Christine explained. "Grand Bertha, just like when they captured the Liège fortress in Antwerp in Belgium." Joffre felt a chill. It seemed to make sense. No, Carnes retorted. "General Christine, you've forgotten we have bombers. Bombers can easily blow the Big Bertha to bits." "I haven't forgotten," Christine explained, pointing to the map. "But the Charles Air Force is mostly deployed on the flanks, especially in the northern Belgium region. The Charles' next move is clearly to push the defensive line further forward, and Belgium is their main focus of attack." Joffre said, "Oh." Understanding Christine's meaning, the Germans hope that the dispersed Charles Air Force will reduce the pressure on Belgium. "Yes," Christine continued her analysis. "Besides, even if the Charles sends some of its air force to Verdun, it might not be very effective." Then Christine looked up at Joffre and said, word by word, "The Germans can use smoke. The smoke will obscure the location of the Big Bertha, and the Air Force won't know where to drop bombs." Joffre wholeheartedly agreed, "But our fortresses won't move. They can only stay in place and be destroyed one after another by the German Big Bertha bombs." Joffre inwardly refused to rely on Charles's air force, believing victory depended on Charles's assistance, and preferred self-reliance. "Exactly," Christine concluded. "Therefore, I think the fortresses are obsolete. As long as the enemy has longer-range artillery, the fortresses are just targets, and the artillery we've deployed inside the fortresses is a huge waste. They might be destroyed by the enemy without firing a single shot, serving almost zero purpose." Joffre nodded emphatically. "We should utilize them, not leave them to die in the fortresses. Only mobile artillery is meaningful." Kane stared at Joffre in astonishment. Did this mean that the Germans were amassing forces at Verdun, and the commander-in-chief was not only not providing reinforcements, but was actually moving artillery and troops away? Chapter 468 For the soldier's interest. Charles was playing to Joffre's tastes. He knew Joffre wouldn't abandon his well-planned battle strategy, a joint counter-offensive by all nations, Romania's declaration of war, followed by a decisive defeat of the Central Powers to end the war. This plan would leave him with a significant, brilliant, and dazzling record, even surpassing Charles's achievements. However, to implement this plan, the artillery stored in Verdun's fortresses would be useless. It had to be deployed to the troops for offensive operations. Therefore, the moment Joffre's gaze fell upon Verdun, he was already considering how to remove the artillery from the fortresses. He only needed an excuse. Christine provided him with a perfect one: the fortresses are outdated. The artillery stored there will only become targets for Big Bertha, and they'll be destroyed one by one before they even have the chance to be used. Makes sense. Joffre was overjoyed and readily transferred the artillery to the field units. The hospital morning was peaceful and solemn. The bells of Notre Dame Cathedral tolled steadily and powerfully, announcing the arrival of a new day. Gallieni leaned against the headboard, staring at the IV drip hanging in the air, watching the clear liquid slowly flow from the rubber tube into his wrist. He was curious, seemingly unable to believe that this would help his condition. Medicine has advanced to this extent now, Gallieni murmured to himself. The image above shows an IV drip from World War I, invented by British chemist Henry Duggan, then called the Callel-Duggan device, mainly used for disinfection and anti-inflammation. Charles entered carrying a bouquet of flowers. He glanced at Gallieni, replacing the flowers as he said, "You look much better today, General." "It's an old ailment." Gallieni raised an eyebrow. "A couple of days of rest will be fine, I know that." Then Gallieni asked, "When are you going back?" "Everyone, including Albert I, will be worried about you while you're away, Brigadier General." This was a matter of maintaining morale, both within the military and among the people. Although Charles could return at any time, the military and civilians would be anxious. "This afternoon," Charles replied, pulling up a chair to sit beside Gallieni's bed. Gallieni nodded, then said seriously, "There's something I have to say. I don't want you to do anything wrong because of me." "What?" Charles feigned ignorance. "You can't fool me, Brigadier General." Gallieni stared at Charles, lowering his voice. "I'm not doing this for Joffre, but for the French soldiers. Your actions against Joffre could have collateral damage." Charles understood Gallieni's meaning. For example, if they set a trap for Joffre at Verdun, causing him to lose the battle, Joffre's reputation would be damaged, and many French soldiers would be wounded or even killed. But Charles calmly replied, "I don't think so, General. I'm doing this precisely for the benefit of the soldiers." "What?" Gallieni didn't understand what Charles was saying. Charles casually picked up an apple from the side, peeling it as he answered, "Have you considered how many French soldiers would die if Joffre remained commander-in-chief longer, or if the so-called encirclement operation were actually launched?" Gallieni fell silent. Charles was right. It was a simple math problem. Everyone knew Joffre would kill more people, so they should have brought him down sooner rather than later. However, Gallieni shook his head and sighed. He decided to give up trying to persuade Charles. That afternoon, Charles flew back to Antwerp Airport. Before leaving, he instructed Lieutenant Colonel Fernand to strengthen Gallieni's security and prevent Joffre from meeting with Gallieni under any circumstances. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand hesitated upon hearing this order. "But Joffre is the commander-in-chief, General," Lieutenant Colonel Fernand said. "If he wants to see General Gallieni, I have no right to stop him, then beat him so badly that he can't meet with anyone," Charles said firmly. "It was my order. You can blame everything on me." "Yes, General." Lieutenant Colonel Fernand seemed to understand. He stepped forward and replied, "I will ensure that Joffre can no longer provoke General Gallieni." Although Charles was in command post, his mind was entirely on Verdun. Joffre has ordered the artillery, along with the artillery units, to be transferred from the fortress. He intends to incorporate the artillery into the 7th Army, which is near Verdun. Although it's being transferred, it can be deployed to Verdun at any time. The 1st Special Artillery Division is equipped with Charles A1 tanks, as well as Saint-Cham tanks. Joffre hopes the 1st Special Artillery Division can play a decisive role in his plans, just like your troops. These were telegrams from Christine. To be precise, Christine forwarded them through Lady in White to avoid suspicion. After all, if he contacted Charles too frequently, It would soon arouse Joffre's suspicion. Upon seeing the intelligence, Charles nodded secretly. Joffre had no doubt that all of this was tailor-made for him. It was conceivable that in the not-too-distant future, Joffre would suffer another defeat, and a crushing one at that. When the Germans attacked, he not only failed to prepare, but also emptied his artillery and troops, practically to support the German offensive, just as he had a year earlier concentrated his main forces on the attacks on Alsace and Lorraine, putting Paris in danger. But Charles knew this wasn't enough to ruin Joffre's reputation. After all, this wasn't the first time France had collapsed under Joffre's command, nor was it the first time Joffre had made a commanding error, each time conveniently dismissed with a plausible excuse. Brigadier General, Tigny waved his hand in front of Charles. Charles, lost in thought, suddenly snapped out of it. What? Tigny handed Charles a supply list. The Saint-Étienne arsenal sent a batch of shotguns and some things called submachine guns. They said this is what you wanted? Oh, yes. Charles took the list and saw 200 shotguns and 100 submachine guns. What do we need these for? Tigny asked. Especially the shotguns. He couldn't believe the army would use something civilians used for hunting. Training, Charles replied, handing the list back to Tigny. Distribute these guns. For now, add a shotgunner to each infantry squad, and the squad leader will use a submachine gun, but these guns, trench warfare, General, Charles explained. As mentioned before, the infantry advanced to clear obstacles. Tigny exclaimed oh, with sudden understanding, his expression soon shifting from confusion to delight. Good heavens, these might be equipment for close range, mass casualties against the enemy, helping the troops quickly and effectively capture trenches. Chapter 469 Forcing Ziafa'i to abdicate. Verdun is located in northeastern France. Its flat terrain made it an important military stronghold since the Middle Ages. The few remaining hills were converted into fortresses by the French army, with trenches built in front of them. Infantry could then encircle the fortresses to provide protection when necessary. At this time, most of the trees in front of the fortresses had been cut down or destroyed by the French, leaving only bare earth and scattered shell craters. The image above shows one of the Verdun fortresses, the Douaumont fortress, which originally housed 6 155mm cannons, 6 120mm cannons, and 6 75mm cannons. Colonel Briand, now 60 years old, was the commander of the 19th Infantry Regiment stationed at Verdun. He anxiously peered through his binoculars into the distant trenches at the German positions. The German lines were becoming increasingly dense, and occasionally Colonel Briand could spot artillery pieces hidden in bunkers. Although camouflaged, they did not escape his notice. Colonel, a soldier reported from behind, the 7th Army says they want to dismantle the fortress's artillery. Colonel Darien turned and saw a major leading a group of soldiers in. No, Major, Darien quickly stepped forward to stop them. Other places are fine, but not here. This is the front line, we need our artillery. The Major helplessly spread his hands. It's no use telling us this, Colonel. We're just following orders. Then the Major added, if you have any questions, you should consult the Commander-in-Chief. Darien hesitated for a moment, then sighed and stepped aside, watching helplessly as they dismantled the artillery and carried it away in pieces. Colonel Dura had reported this to Joffre, but each time the response was the same. I know what to do, you just need to obey orders, Colonel. Then Joffre would complain, these guys are always so stingy with their equipment, completely oblivious to the fact that artillery is useless in the fortress. Just then, the rumble of engines filled the sky. Colonel Dura stepped out of the fortress and looked up. It was a German reconnaissance plane, and another one in the distance. Colonel, Lieutenant Colonel Charles, a staff officer, approached. The Germans are increasing their reconnaissance here. They seem to want to photograph every inch of this land. Lieutenant Colonel Charles shared the same concern. All the signs pointed to an imminent German attack on Verdun. He could sense it, but Joffre had inexplicably emptied the fortress. I should do something. Colonel Darien gritted his teeth, turned and strode quickly toward the rear garage, saying as he walked, I need to go to Lodgerton and talk to Joffre. Lieutenant Colonel Charles caught up from behind. That won't do any good, Colonel, you know that. Colonel Darien slowed his pace, finally nodding helplessly and stopping in place. He had already said what needed to be said to Joffre in the telegram. Going in person would only be repeating the same thing. After a moment of silence, Colonel Darien said, perhaps there is another way. We can report to the government. Charles was taken aback and quickly stopped him. That's going over his head, Colonel. You'll offend Joffre? He knew Colonel Delian had connections. He could even contact Clemenceau or the Minister of War directly. Before the outbreak of the war, Colonel Delian was a member of Parliament from Nancy. The image above shows Colonel Delian during World War I. He was the son-in-law of Boulanger, a retired veteran who entered politics and was elected to Parliament. After the outbreak of World War I, he resolutely returned to the army and became a colonel, but he did not leave Parliament, maintaining contact with it as a member and having certain connections within it. Colonel Delian hummed in agreement, glanced in the direction of the German troops, and nodded slightly. I know, but we can't worry about that now. Originally, the situation in Verdun would not have been known to the French government. Joffre treated it as a military secret. But Delian submitted a report to the Paris government. The Germans are gathering in Verdun, infantry, artillery, and aircraft. We have reason to believe they will attack here soon, but our artillery and troops have been dismantled and redeployed. Not only that, our supplies are also severely insufficient, even including barbed wire. Verdun is in imminent danger. This matter instantly caused a huge uproar in the government and Parliament, and the House of Representatives immediately convened a meeting to discuss the matter. As usual, there were voices of both support and opposition. I think this was Joffre's intention. As commander-in-chief, he may have reasons we don't know, and these reasons might be inconvenient to disclose, otherwise it would be easy to leak secrets. Since we've entrusted the army to him, we should trust him and give him enough freedom. Opponents responded sarcastically. If it were Charles doing this, I would absolutely believe it was the right thing to do, but he's Joffre? Laughter erupted in the House of Representatives. Many people didn't believe in Joffre's command, including members of Congress and government officials who knew nothing about military affairs. Armand rose to his feet and walked slowly to the podium, speaking with unwavering confidence. Gentlemen, I do not believe this was the right decision, although I know nothing, no intelligence, no German intentions. I'm completely ignorant of military matters. I bet Joffre has been tricked this time, fallen into the German trap, once again. Think about it, from the attack on Lorraine to the Battle of the Marne or any other battle, Joffre has failed to make timely and correct judgments. I would even say that whatever decision Joffre made, we were right to simply go in the opposite direction. Laughter erupted again in the House of Representatives. Armand continued, save those poor French soldiers, listen to their cries, they are dying pointlessly. Not because they lack courage, nor because the enemy is strong, but because they have an incompetent commander-in-chief. Why should we continue to keep Joffre in the position of commander-in-chief? What has he done? Joffre's supporters rose to their feet in opposition, some shouting, you shameless traitor, you have no right to say such things, get out of here. You only want to harm France for your own benefit, you should resign as a member of Parliament. They were just shouting, but unexpectedly, Armand responded smoothly, very well, that's exactly what I'm planning to do. Let's make a bet. If I'm wrong, I'll immediately resign as a member of Parliament and disappear from your sight forever, but if I'm right, Armand paused, then said, word by word. Then we should replace him with someone else as Commander-in-Chief of France. The meeting room fell silent. The members of Parliament then realized that Armand was using another method to force Joffre's resignation. Chapter 470 The Commander-in-Chief is resting, you must not wake him. Verdun in September was rather chilly. The sun didn't peek through the fog all day, only sparingly casting a few stray rays of light as the sun began to set, like a meager offering to the soldiers stationed on the border, locked in a standoff. Suddenly, a shout broke the silence. Hey, German, how's your day? It was a young French soldier, leaning against the side of the trench, head tilted back, shouting so his voice would carry. This was a way for frontline soldiers to alleviate loneliness. They often talked to the enemy, seeking a bit of excitement in their daily tense, monotonous, and oppressive lives. Usually, the German would reply in broken French, not bad. I got a letter from my wife, and she even sent me a photograph, but I heard some bad news, my 18-year-old son has been drafted. Be careful when you see him. Oh, and I also received a jug of wine, that's wonderful. But today the German said nothing. Silence reigned on the other side, as if all the German soldiers had died. The French soldier, disappointed at receiving no response, muttered, these bastards, all they do is sleep. Don't blame me for cutting off your ears when the fighting starts. The surrounding French soldiers burst into laughter. At that moment, Delian appeared at the trench with his staff and several guards. The soldiers rose to greet him. Delian nodded, his face expressionless, and asked, any new developments? No, Colonel, nothing. Captain Erlanchi, in charge, answered. A young soldier interjected, the Germans seem quieter these past few days. Maybe they were afraid of us, someone countered, you haven't done anything, Leo. If Charles were here, they'd have a reason to be afraid. The soldiers chuckled again. Drian didn't speak. He took out his binoculars, leaned against the trench, stepped onto the ramp, and cautiously peered out. The trench fell silent instantly. The soldiers held their breath, staring at Drian. Some even grabbed their rifles, ready to provide cover for the colonel. With their extensive combat experience, they knew that peering into the trenches to observe the enemy was extremely dangerous when the sun was setting. Fortunately, there was no gunfire from the other side, and after a few minutes, Darian withdrew his head. Darian sat on the footstool for a while, seemingly recalling what he had just seen. Then, in a deep voice, he ordered the soldiers, stay alert and observe the enemy's movements. Yes, Colonel. As soon as Darian stepped into the trench, he whispered to Charles, something's not right. The Germans might be about to make their move. Charles nodded, pale-faced. I sensed something was off too, Colonel. No, not just off, Colonel Darian replied. Some artillery pieces have already removed their camouflage. Charles's eyes widened instantly. You mean, tonight? Colonel Darian nodded slightly. Very likely tonight. After taking a few more steps, he turned back and ordered, send a telegram to headquarters immediately, reporting the situation here. Yes, Colonel, Charles replied habitually, but then added, however, as before, we can't have any hope. Colonel Darian nodded in understanding. More than a month had passed, and Drian's overstepping of his superior's authority led Joffre to direct his criticism at Drian. Joffre even sent a telegram to the entire army. Officers should report problems through the proper channels. For soldiers under my command to bypass their superiors and send complaints or protests about carrying out my orders to the government is tantamount to deliberately disrupting military discipline and undermining internal unity. Although Joffre did not name names, everyone knew he was referring to Drian. Many speculated that Colonel Drian had not been dismissed or punished because he also held another position, a member of parliament. After considering for a moment, Colonel Drian added an order. We should send a few more communications soldiers. Perhaps this will attract the attention of headquarters. Tell the commander-in-chief that this is not the time for personal grudges. Lieutenant Colonel Charles nodded. I'll arrange it immediately. Soon, a sidecar sped out of the fortress, carrying 3 soldiers, a driver, a guard, and in the side seat sat Major Jules, the regiment's most eloquent staff officer. Lieutenant Colonel Charles hoped that Major Jules could at least secure something for Verdun. At the Langdon command post, Joffre's gaze was fixed on Balfour on the map. A few days earlier, he had received a warning from the British that the Germans' real target was likely Balfour, and all their actions at Verdun might be a feint. I knew it, Joffre exclaimed smugly upon receiving the intelligence. No one would choose Verdun as a breakthrough point unless they were a fool or blind. The next second, he ordered the main force of the 7th Army to be moved to Balfour, including the large-caliber artillery recently salvaged from Verdun. We should also move the 1st Artillery Division there, Joffre said to Carnes, pointing to Balfour. Strengthen Balfour's defenses. Carnes was somewhat puzzled. But the role of tanks seems to be offensive. Offensive, of course, Joffre replied. Defense is just a facade, Carnes. Once the enemy's offensive loses momentum, the tank units will immediately launch a counter-offensive to catch the Germans off guard. Joffre remained focused on his encirclement plan. At that moment, a communications soldier delivered a telegram. General, Colonel Delian has telegraphed. He says the Germans are about to launch an attack, most likely tonight. Joffre scoffed, a hint of contempt on his lips. He knows nothing, the communications soldier continued, but he mentioned that a large number of German troops are massing in Verdun, and their artillery is ready to fire. That's just a German charade, Joffre asserted. He only sees part of it, but thinks it's the whole story. A hint of helplessness flashed in Joffre's eyes as he looked up at the communications soldier and said, tell him to do his job. Yes, General. It was nearly 9:30 p.m. when Major Jules's sidecar arrived in Ladgerden. Major Jules first found a telephone, hoping to inform Colonel Delian that they had arrived. The call had barely connected when a burst of artillery fire and Colonel Duraz's shouts filled the air. They've opened fire. The bombardment is unprecedented. At least 1,000 large-caliber artillery pieces are bombarding us. Our radio has been damaged. Report this to. The call was cut off before he could finish, and Major Jules's shouts were futile. He guessed the telephone line had been severed by artillery fire. meaning the front lines were cut off from communication. He quickly hung up and headed towards Joffre's command post, soon on his run. The situation was urgent. Every second could determine the lives of frontline soldiers and the outcome of the battle. However, he was stopped by guards at the command post entrance. "I need to see the commander-in-chief, immediately," Major Jules shouted anxiously. "Excuse me, Major," the guard replied coldly, "the commander-in-chief is resting." "You cannot wake him." Jules froze, completely forgetting Joffre's habit of sleeping on time. Note, this section is based on historical facts. The Battle of Verdun had already begun, and the messenger who brought the news arrived at the headquarters, only to be told that the general had already gone to bed and should not be woken. Chapter 471. This is the French tranquilizer. Colonel Dura was mistaken about one point. The Germans used not just thousands of artillery to bomb Verdun, but over 2,000. On a nearly 10-kilometer front from Verdun, the Germans deployed 2,000 howitzers, 500 mortars, and a dozen powerful 210mm howitzers interspersed among them. The image above shows a German 210mm howitzer from 1910, with a range of 9,400 meters and a projectile weight of 120 kilograms. During preparations for the attack, the Germans not only stockpiled large quantities of ammunition but also deployed 30 engineer companies and over 20 railway companies to improve transportation, with a total workforce exceeding 20,000. They also sent over 200 trainloads of artillery shells to the front lines. Ironically, while the Germans were busily completing their infrastructure, the French were busy dismantling artillery and redeploying troops. At 9 p.m. on September 3rd, bored French soldiers retreated into their tunnels and bunkers, intending to end the day with sleep. Suddenly, 3 red signal flares rose into the sky. French soldiers, noticing the light, curiously emerged and looked in the direction of the source. They hadn't seen such things in a long time. Was it a German attack signal? They must be crazy. This was Verdun. The next second, the entire area shook violently. All the German artillery positions, large and small, deployed at the front and rear, opened fire simultaneously. Countless shells rained down on the French positions, the flames illuminating both sidelines and the sky above. And this was only the beginning. Shells, whistling sharply, continued to streak across the sky, rapidly flying from the German positions to the French. Then came a series of explosions, plumes of smoke radiating outwards in the flames, mingling with the dust billowing into the air to form a dark cloud of smoke. The French soldiers were completely unprepared. Colonel Delian was the only one who believed the Germans would attack, and he had been ordered not to spread rumors such as "the Germans are about to attack," as it would disrupt morale. The soldiers were stunned by the sudden barrage of artillery fire. They stared blankly at everything, and when they came to their senses, they screamed and frantically searched for cover. But in the darkness, in their panic, they didn't know where to hide. The tunnels were either collapsed or were crumbling with earth falling down. They looked more like dark, gaping graves than safe places. Even the seemingly impregnable fortresses crumbled and became ruins under the bombardment. Colonel Delian, his ears ringing and his vision blurred inside the fortress, couldn't help but cover his ears and shout. The dim light flickered above him, then finally plunged him into complete darkness. He stumbled open the door to the combat zone and saw soldiers setting up machine guns. "Get out of there," Colonel Delian yelled. The German artillery preparations weren't over yet, and it was unlikely any enemy would come up now. Setting up a machine gun would only put them in danger. But the machine gunners couldn't hear his shouts. Just as Colonel Delian was about to pull them down, a deafening roar and flash of light followed, and the 2 machine gunners were violently thrown backward, crashing against the wall like logs before sliding down and collapsing to the ground. Colonel Delian went over to check on them. Blood was gushing from their mouths, noses, and ears. And their faces were split open like shattered mirrors. The lights came back on. Someone must have turned on the backup power. Colonel Delian gritted his teeth, abandoned the 2 wounded men, and ran down the corridor towards the command post. As soon as he entered, he ordered the communications officer, "Send a signal to headquarters. The radio's been damaged, Colonel." "Then make a call," Colonel Delian shouted angrily. "The phone is busy," the communications officer shouted back. "Perhaps too many people are on the phone right now." Just then, the phone miraculously rang. Colonel Delian lunged forward, grabbed the phone, and, ignoring who was on the other end, yelled into the receiver, "They've opened fire. The artillery barrage is unprecedented. Report to the commander-in-chief immediately." Before he could finish, the call was cut off. Colonel Delian stared blankly at the artillery fire outside for a moment, then took a deep breath and coldly ordered, "The final moment has arrived, gentlemen. Prepare for battle." Joffre received the news an hour later. Major Jules found Deputy Commander-in-Chief Carnes, who then woke Joffre through Carnes. Before waking Joffre, Carnes hesitated. He asked Major Jules, "Are you sure the Germans are launching a full-scale attack?" "I'm more inclined to believe it's a feint." "No, General, I'm quite certain," Major Jules replied anxiously. "I heard artillery fire on the phone. It was intense." Colonel Duras said at least 1,000 guns were firing at Verdun. As he spoke, Major Jules felt a chill run down his spine, as if he had suddenly swallowed a glass of ice water, the cold seeping straight to his heart. They seemed to think this intelligence wasn't worth waking Joffre. Shouldn't every piece of intelligence be reported? Even a small battle. And now, with such a major event happening at the front, they were still assessing whether it was more important than Joffre's sleep. What happened next left Major Jules speechless. Keynes led Major Jules to Joffre's lounge and cautiously knocked on the door. After waiting a while and receiving no response, he knocked a few more times. This time, Joffre's voice was finally heard. "What's the situation, General?" Keynes reported. "It's a staff officer sent by Colonel Delian. He says the Germans are already attacking Verdun." "Colonel Delian again," Joffre complained. "Can't he just shut up? Tell him it's a feint by the Germans, General," Major Jules shouted, barely suppressing his anger. "Towards the closed door, thousands of cannons are bombarding Verdun. Shouldn't you be concerned? At least you should consider that Colonel Delian might report this to the government, just like last time, Major." Keynes tried to stop Jules, but seeing the murderous rage in the other's eyes, he swallowed the rest of his words. The lights in the room finally came on. Then came the slow sound of changing clothes. After a while, Joffre emerged, impeccably dressed, even his cap perfectly aligned, clearly having corrected himself in front of the mirror. He slowly nodded to Major Jules. "All right, Major. Let's go see what happened. However, I should warn you," he added, "this might not be what you think." A vein throbbed on Major Jules's forehead. This was French tranquilizer? Why did he have the urge to pull out his pistol and kill this guy? Chapter 472. Everything was arranged by Charles. At dawn, Charles was awakened as usual by the noise of camel fighter planes taking off. Every day at daybreak, 6 planes would fly in 3 groups in 3 different directions to patrol, one of the methods used by the Germans to prevent them from spying on the deployment of their troops. Charles quickly washed up in his uniform and walked towards the command post, yawning. He had barely sat down when an orderly brought him breakfast: mashed potatoes, a slice of bread, some jam, and a small piece of chocolate. This was thanks to Albert I, who believed that the heroes who liberated Belgium should not be mistreated, and therefore mobilized the Belgians to improve the food for the French army, only Charles's troops. The Battle of Verdun has begun, Tigeny, who had been hunched over, staring at the map and making notes, said without looking up. "You've won again, Brigadier General." Charles, who was munching on his bread, suddenly looked up at Tigeny, startled. Did this guy know that all of this was a trap he had deliberately set? Tigeny's next words relieved Charles. He tossed a document onto Charles's desk. "The Germans used your tactics, almost exactly the same as when you attacked Antwerp," Charles said. "Oh," realizing that was it. He chuckled softly, continuing to eat while flipping through the document with his other hand. Sure enough, just as Tigeny had said, the Germans first prepared with artillery fire, followed by infantry charging behind the tanks. They even used Molotov cocktails to guide the tanks' attack. If there was any difference, it was that the German artillery preparation lasted 5 hours, from 9 o'clock to 2 o'clock the next morning. Charles complained, "They should pay some royalties." "Oh, yes," Tigeny chuckled, turning to Charles with disbelief in his eyes. "It would be best to hire you as an instructor, wouldn't it?" "Forget it," Charles replied. "I'd be drowned in French spittle." Tigeny shook his head with a wry smile, pushed Charles's plate aside, and spread a map on the empty table. "The first line of defense at Verdun has been easily breached. They are now attacking the Daumont fortress. The Daumont fortress is crucial. If it falls, Verdun is in danger." The map above shows Verdun. Most of the places marked with names are fortresses, dozens of them in total. The red arrows indicate the direction of the German attack, their main forces advancing through the area between the 2 circularly marked fortresses, directly towards the central Daumont fortress. Charles nodded in agreement. The Daumont fortress was the center of the Verdun fortress complex, connected to many trenches, making it a vital stronghold. Once it fell to the Germans, the French defenses would be divided in two, and the other fortresses would be unable to communicate and would fight independently. What was Joffre's reaction? Charles asked casually. He insisted it was a feint by the Germans. Tigny shrugged helplessly, even though everyone else thought it wasn't. This was common sense. A feint wouldn't involve continuous bombardment for 5 hours followed by the deployment of tanks and a large number of troops. Otherwise, the cost would be too high. Charles simply smiled and remained silent. He knew Joffre was stubbornly holding on, and it seemed he had no other choice but to do so as well. In reality, Charles had blocked Joffre's escape route, arranging a bet between Armand and Joffre in Parliament. On the surface, it appeared to be a war of words. In reality, however, if Joffre admitted that the German army was the main force in the Verdun offensive and withdrew his troops, it would mean Armand had won, and Parliament would have a legitimate reason to discuss Joffre's future as commander-in-chief. This would be a humiliating defeat for Joffre, especially since his better was Armand, who knew nothing about military affairs and was a right-winger. In the fog-shrouded Paris Chamber of Deputies, groups of 3 or 5 members hurried into the meeting room and took their seats. This was a special meeting convened in response to the outbreak of the Verdun campaign, and they had also called in Gallieri, who had just returned from the hospital, to participate in the questioning. Gallieri was one of the few authoritative military experts in Paris. As soon as the meeting began, someone immediately raised the question everyone wanted to know. General Gallieni, based on your military experience, do you think the German attack on Verdun was a feint? General Gallieni's face was still pale, but his voice was loud and powerful. I don't think so, because no feint has ever reached this scale. If it weren't for the valiant fighting of the officers and soldiers at the front, Verdun might already be in German hands. The members of Parliament were in an uproar. Then someone asked curiously, who is holding back the Germans at the front? Colonel Delian. Gallieni replied, as far as I know, he only has about 750 soldiers under his command, and so far, they have suffered more than 300 casualties. Another gasp rippled through the meeting room. We should send reinforcements immediately. No, Gallieni replied, the German artillery fire is too intense. Most of our reinforcements have been killed on the way. The artillery being moved from the fortress directly resulted in the Germans having an absolute artillery advantage. Any suspicious troops appearing in the open ground outside the fortress would be blown to bits. Then what should we do? Just wait like this, Gallieri replied. We can wait until nightfall, then there will be a chance for reinforcements. The darkness will be the best cover, but Colonel Delian is the commander of an infantry regiment. Why does he only have a little over 700 men? A councillor asked, puzzled. You know, Gallieri answered truthfully, Joffre has diverted artillery and artillerymen. The fortress troops were organized by bunkers, mixing infantry and artillery. With all the artillery gone, only a pitiful 700 men remained. Naturally, everyone thought of Joffre. He was the one who caused all this. Colonel Delian had repeatedly warned him, but he remained stubborn. However, the councillors didn't voice their opinions. Some even turned their gazes to Armand. Perhaps sensing this, Armand rose gracefully. No, I will not say anything detrimental to the war effort. Gentlemen, now is not the time to assign blame. The battle has begun. Although I am not an expert in military affairs, I know that changing generals in the midst of battle is a grave mistake. We should be focusing on resolving the immediate crisis. His words surprised everyone. The councillors hadn't expected the usually uncompromising Armand to speak with such foresight and a sense of the bigger picture. Only Gallieni sighed inwardly. Everything was arranged by Charles, and so was Armand. Armand wasn't speaking favorably of Joffre. He wanted Joffre to expose greater weaknesses and make more mistakes until all the councillors could no longer tolerate the commander-in-chief. But the price paid was the defeat at Verdun and the lives of soldiers. Armand smiled slightly at Gallieni on the platform. He never imagined that one day he would become Gallieni's comrade-in-arms. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 473 How Can We Attack? The French reinforcement of Nauama was not as easy as expected. The Germans had already surrounded the fortress and occupied the surrounding high ground, and any reinforcements entering the vicinity of the fortress would be met with resistance. Soon after, another alarming event occurred. The Germans mixed poison gas into their shells. Some soldiers were unknowingly poisoned, and the symptoms were different from before, indicating that the Germans had invented a new type of poison gas. The image above shows a phosgene shell, used by both sides in World War I, with a total usage of 100,000 tons. Even more terrifying was that this poison gas was loaded into shells and fired at the French, instead of being released from gas canisters as before. The Germans were clearly prepared. Regardless of whether the Germans used poison gas, the French soldiers needed to wear gas masks, because no one knew whether the shells fired at them contained poison gas. Without gas masks, it would be too late by the time they realized. Wearing gas masks, however, would impair their vision, making night fighting almost impossible. The result was predictable. Douaumont fell around 11 p.m. that night. Colonel Drian, finding himself surrounded by German forces, attempted a breakout, but a shrapnel bullet struck him in the back of the head, killing him instantly. Note, Colonel Drian was a Verdun hero. He led 750 soldiers in a desperate fight, with only 94 surviving, a casualty rate of nearly 90%. News soon reached Paris, enraging the people who had been sleepless with worry about the war. They knew Colonel Drian was the man who had repeatedly warned them, only to be ignored by Joffre, and now, due to Joffre's incompetence, Drian and his men had perished at the hands of the Germans. It was almost as if Joffre had killed them. People took to the streets with flashlights, chanting repeatedly, "Joffre must be held responsible. We don't need a commander-in-chief like this. Our soldiers are brave, but they have an incompetent commander." Under the pressure of public opinion, Joffre, overwhelmed and helpless, made several more mistakes in command. After the fall of Fort Dumont, the 72nd Infantry Division stationed at Brabant abandoned its positions and withdrew to the second line of defense without permission. Retreating from Brabant was a wise move, as it was almost completely surrounded by German forces. Note, Brabant is the location circled in red on the left side of the previous map. It was the front line, and Brabant was the most vulnerable point for the Germans to be encircled after a breakout. This was actually an oversight on Joffre's part. He should have ordered the division to retreat much earlier. However, when Joffre learned of the division's unauthorized withdrawal, he angrily immediately order this unit to go back and retake the lost positions. Not an inch of land can be given up. We must fight with all our might and at all costs to retake it. The 72nd Infantry Division was forced to launch an attack, only to be encircled and suffer heavy casualties. That night was a disaster. Joffre recklessly ordered his troops to launch a counter-offensive against the Germans, perhaps believing that only by retaking the lost territory could he satisfy those who criticized him. The German army, one of their objectives was to deplete the French manpower and bleed the French dry. Instead, they halted their advance, using the captured fortresses and trenches to set up guns and mow down hordes of French soldiers on their way. As dawn broke, under the dim light, Gallieni, fully clothed, lay asleep on his bed in the lounge. He wanted to participate in the Battle of Verdun, but Joffre's arrogant temperament prevented others from interfering, and Gallieni's City Defense Command received very few telegrams throughout the campaign. Suddenly, hurried footsteps sounded from the direction of the corridor. Gallieni opened his eyes. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand's voice rang out from outside the door. "General, Major Jules has just arrived from the front. He wishes to speak with you." Major Jules. Gallieni slowly sat up, fumbled for his glasses by the bedside for a moment, put them on, and frowned, considering for a while. "Do I know him? Or am I just too old to remember?" Lieutenant Colonel Fernand added. "He was Colonel Drian's subordinate," Gallieni said. "Oh," and then, "let him in, immediately." A moment later, Major Jules appeared before Gallieni. Under the light, it was clear that his body and face were stained with blood, his eyes were red and swollen, but his uniform was intact. "I am very sorry, Major," General Gallieni said. "I heard the news of Colonel Drian's sacrifice, and the fallen soldiers of the 19th Infantry Regiment. They are all heroes of France." Major Jules swallowed hard. "I didn't come for that, General." "Then you are." General Gallieni was somewhat confused. Major Jules took a deep breath and stood up, saying, "I hope you can persuade the council to remove Commander-in-Chief Joffre from his post." "General." Gallieni was utterly shocked. He suddenly stood up, his tone turning furious. "You should know this is more serious than reporting to higher authorities. This is tantamount to treason, especially while we are still fighting. I could even execute you for this." "I know, General." Major Jules interrupted Gallieni, his voice filled with tragic resolve. "You can execute me, General. But please grant my request, replace the commander-in-chief. Galleri was somewhat surprised and admired the young man's courage. Being executed by one's own people on the execution ground and dying on the battlefield are two different things. Although both are death, the former is with shame while the latter is with glory. If one is not afraid of dying with shame, one must have suffered a tremendous shock. Then Galleri seemed to understand, and he gently advised, I understand, Major. You want to avenge Colonel Drian and your comrades, but I don't think this is wise or advisable. That's war. As a soldier, you should know this isn't entirely Joffre's fault. Major Jules interrupted Galleri again. No, General, I'm not doing this for revenge. It's to prevent more people from dying at Joffre's hands. With that, Major Jules pulled a piece of paper from his pocket with his blood-stained hands and handed it over, reporting, before coming here, I did a survey at the field hospital. There are over 3,000 people in the hospital. If you include those who fell on the battlefield and those not yet brought back, there are at least tens of thousands of casualties. Galleri was shocked. Tens of thousands of casualties? In one night, good heavens, the French were on the defensive, and they had fortifications. How could there be tens of thousands of casualties? However, Jules replied decisively, I'm sure, General. Because we've been attacking all night. Galleri was instantly speechless, his mouth agape. How could they attack knowing the Germans had used a new type of poison gas? Chapter 474 Foch's Blame. Early in the morning, Ziafi, who had a good night's sleep, got up at 8 o'clock as usual. After having breakfast, she took a walk on the forest path next to the command post, her big belly sticking out. The image above shows a size comparison between Marshal Joffre and his entourage, Canes, only half Joffre's size, cautiously followed beside him, reporting on last night's battle. We failed to recapture Fort Douaumont as expected. The Germans were well prepared. They used a new type of poison gas that could be fired from artillery shells into our positions. This increased the difficulty and danger of night fighting. A hint of displeasure flashed in Joffre's eyes, but he responded casually, ultimately, it's because their will to attack wasn't strong enough. As long as the poison gas interference is eliminated, those losses are almost negligible. We can still successfully recapture Fort Douaumont. As long as they can advance, victory is within their grasp. Canes nodded in agreement, then leaned closer and lowered his voice. More than 12,000 men were killed last night, General. There are some discordant voices in Parliament. Some members question the government. Joffre's name is no longer synonymous with confidence. On the contrary, are we still binding our fate to him? Joffre cleared his throat, slightly embarrassed. And Canes wisely shut his mouth. Silence fell, save for a few blackbirds hopping and chirping on the branches overhead, their eyes glaring as if accusing Joffre of wrongdoing. Joffre knew his predicament. He had hoped for a victory in last night's battle to extricate himself, but unfortunately, the war hadn't unfolded as he'd hoped. These cowards, Joffre cursed inwardly. Why can't they bravely charge at the enemy? Taking a few steps with his head down, Joffre suddenly asked, does Foch really look ill? Canes looked bewildered. He'd never heard of Foch being ill. But he quickly realized, nodding, you think so too? I thought only General Castelnu's staff believed Foch was sick. Joffre smiled slightly, saying nothing. The image above shows General Castelnu, then commander of Army Group East. He was known for his ability to promote Pétain, but he was at odds with Foch and had suggested that Foch resign from his position as commander of Army Group North due to health issues. Foch's headquarters moved to Brussels. This was for ease of command, as telegrams were unreliable at the time, and telephones were the primary means of communication. Telephone lines between France and Belgium were limited, and during the German occupation of Belgium, they were intentionally isolated from France. Remotely commanding Army Group North by telephone from within France was not only vulnerable to being cut off but also highly susceptible to eavesdropping. Foch didn't focus much on the Verdun campaign. He was preoccupied with attacking Leuven and the Namur fortress to expand Belgium's gains. If we can reach Liège and consolidate our Belgian advantage, the German flanks and rear will be exposed to us, Foch confidently told his staff. Therefore, we are the ones who ultimately decide the outcome. However, Belgium, a small country, was riddled with fortifications, while France lacked artillery. To be precise, it wasn't a lack of artillery. France had countless 75mm guns. But attacking fortified positions and strongholds required larger caliber, longer-range artillery, like the German Big Bertha. Without these guns, the French army would be constantly bombarded by German fortified artillery on their advance. Foch was reluctant to continue relying on Charles. It made him feel like he was fighting under Charles's protection. How should we attack? Foch muttered to himself. Can't we fight without Charles? At that moment, Wei Gang approached with a serious expression, holding a telegram. He hesitated, wanting to hand it over but then withdrew his hand, as if he wanted to speak but couldn't. Foch, who was looking at a map, noticed this and looked up in confusion, asking, "What's going on?" Wei Gang didn't speak, but silently handed over the telegram. Foch glanced at the telegram and froze. It was from War Minister Mesamy. "Due to your health reasons, we have decided to resign as commander of Army Group North and appoint you as director of the Military Research Center. Please report to Paris after you have handed over your duties. Thank you for everything you have done for France. Long live France." Foch looked bewildered. He looked up at Wei Gang, then at the telegram, thinking he was seeing things. Health reasons? Resignation. Wei Gang sighed softly and replied quietly, "The Parisian media has published unfavorable comments about you, claiming that the erroneous decision to attack Verdun was made with your support." Foch understood. This was a scapegoat that Joffre was trying to pin on him to save his own position. He stood up angrily. "If the government wants to dismiss me, then dismiss me. But they shouldn't say I'm sick. That's a lie. The bigger lie is the decision at Verdun." Foch paused at this point. He was indeed Joffre's strategist. Joffre consulted him by telegram or phone on almost every decision. The claim that Verdun was supported by him wasn't without basis. The problem was that the information Foch had access to was distorted by Joffre. For example, Joffre's assessment was that reliable intelligence proved the Germans' real target was Belfort, and Verdun was a feint. This was beyond doubt. Based on this, Foch supported Joffre's decision, and Foch wasn't wrong. However, who would listen to his explanation? That bastard! Foch cursed angrily, abruptly standing up and heading to the telegraph room to send a telegram to Joffre questioning him. Joffre, of course, wouldn't admit it, giving an ambiguous reply. "You've been dismissed? I should be dismissed too. We should all be dismissed because we lost. That's war. The victor is king, the loser is villain." Foch knew this was a done deal. Joffre was determined to make him the scapegoat. He walked wearily back to his seat, sat in the chair for a while in a daze, and then finally smiled bitterly. When you want to kill your dog, you start saying it's gone mad. It's a rather ancient rule, with almost no exceptions, but that's not fair, General, Wei Gang said somewhat agitatedly. "You have nothing to do with Verdun's mistakes, you've even just won a victory." Then Wei Gang suggested, "Could we get Charles to say something? After all, we just cooperated with him." Foch gently shook his head. "Charles might be able to defeat the Germans, but he's helpless against these people. This is French politics, a complex web of interpersonal relationships, not something Charles excels at." Note, the events in this chapter are based on historical facts. Online sources briefly mention that Foch was dismissed by the government because of his connection to Joffre. The book Marshal Foch, a biography, provides a more detailed account of Foch's dismissal. The French government actually had no intention of dismissing Foch. Joffre delivered the fatal blow, claiming that Foch made the wrong judgment due to health and age, and that he was senile. Joffre hoped to divert public attention and media focus. Chapter 475 Parliamentary Inquiry. At the Antwerp Airport Command Post, Charles sat at his desk, enjoying afternoon tea while reviewing documents. He was quite satisfied with the current equipment situation. In just over a month, each squad in the armored and mechanized units had been equipped with a shotgun. Submachine guns, due to insufficient production, were temporarily only issued to the armored units. Tigeny protested, "The mechanized units are the ones truly fighting the enemy infantry. Why are the submachine guns being issued to the armored units first?" Charles's answer was simple: "If you're willing to be at the forefront, I'll have them replace the submachine guns with yours immediately." Tigeny immediately fell silent. The armored units were the ones charging at the forefront, tearing through the enemy's defenses. Naturally, they should be prioritized for new weapons, especially since the infantry would be entering the trenches to engage the enemy in close combat. Tigeny wasn't unaware of this, he just wanted to see if he could gain an advantage. At this moment, a telegram arrived from the staff. General Foch has been relieved of his command." "What?" Charles and Tigeny exclaimed in surprise, simultaneously turning to look at the staff officer. Army Group North was the main force supporting Charles in the operation, and their cooperation had been quite smooth in the past. But Foch was suddenly relieved of his command. "It happened this morning," the staff officer reported. General Foch has been transferred back to Paris to serve as director of the Military Research Center. Charles was bewildered. He had no idea what that position entailed. Tycoon explained, it involves military theory work, and sometimes he can also act as an operational advisor, a nominal position. Charles realized he had been sidelined. Then Charles asked, who has taken over? This was crucial for future operations, affecting the cooperation between the two armies. It's General Despair, the staff officer replied. Charles was completely unfamiliar with the name. Tycoon raised an eyebrow helplessly. In your eyes, everyone is the same. They can all claim to have no combat record, Tycoon added, but this General Despair is different. Before the war, he was commanding battles in Morocco. The image above shows General Despair, a French marshal, known for his bravery in combat as the Frenchman who dared to risk his life. Charles still didn't grasp the concept, or perhaps didn't consider him a combat-ready general. Tactics were changing too rapidly in this era. General Despair's combat and command experience accumulated in the colonies was likely not applicable to the modern battlefield. Later, Charles realized this was correct. General Despair preferred using valiant cavalry to charge the enemy. Cavalry, at this time, when the Germans were widely equipped with heavy machine guns and a large number of artillery pieces. General, a communications soldier reported, a telegram from Paris. Parliament wants you to appear before the Chamber of Deputies at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning for questioning. Charles was speechless. The army group commander had just been replaced, and morale was low. Was it appropriate to recall him to Parliament for questioning? However, Charles immediately realized this might be related to Joffre. Charles guessed correctly. Joffre had sent Carnegie to Paris to garner parliamentary and government support. Parliament believed they shouldn't only listen to Joffre's side of the story, there needed to be a counter-argument against Carnegie. Gallieri might be a good choice, but apart from the Battle of Paris, he hadn't participated in any other battles and lacked a deep understanding of modern warfare. So they decided to recall Charles from Belgium. No one understood modern warfare better than Charles. He was sure he could find Carnes's weakness. This was Charles's second time entering the House of Representatives. The last time was over the issue of changing military uniforms, which many opposed, thus harboring hostility towards Charles. This time was different. Charles received a warm round of applause as soon as he entered the House. The members looked at Charles with respect, envy, and admiration, regardless of whether they were on Charles's side. Even James was no exception. He's a military genius, James said to those around him while clapping, and a respectable and formidable opponent. No one could turn the tide of the war and liberate a third of Belgium in a single day, that must be acknowledged. Carnes was standing on the podium when he saw Charles walk to the front row and calmly take his seat. Instantly, an invisible pressure rolled in, and his proud head unconsciously lowered slightly. Most members of Parliament didn't understand war and were easy to fool, but Charles was not like that. The applause gradually subsided, and Carnes began his speech. Gentlemen, many people believe the Battle of Verdun was a mistake, and General Joffre is responsible for it, but in reality, there are many things beyond our control. For example, the Germans seized the initiative. If we hadn't redeployed our forces to Balfour, they might very well have attacked there. I mean, it was a matter of German decision-making, not simply a miscalculation. Charles stood up and interrupted Carnes. General, could you tell me how long the Germans conducted their artillery preparations before the attack? Carnes hesitated, then answered with difficulty. 5 hours, Brigadier General. Charles asked again. 5 hours of artillery preparation, with thousands of cannons, must have required at least hundreds of thousands of shells, right? Carnes nodded. Yes, at 5 or 6 shells per minute, 1,000 cannons could fire 1.5 million shells in 5 hours, even after deducting rest and malfunction times. It would easily reach hundreds of thousands. Charles stared at Keynes on the stage and slowed his speech. So, you still think that a place capable of firing hundreds of thousands of shells in one go is a feint attack point? And that it can be changed at will? Keynes was speechless. The members of Parliament immediately echoed loudly, that's right, the Germans have fired far more than just a few 100,000 shells. They're still bombarding us relentlessly. Their artillery fire has always been superior. This couldn't be achieved in a day or two of preparation. They've been preparing for at least a month, and Joffre was completely unaware of this, despite Colonel Delien's repeated warnings. Mentioning Colonel Delien immediately sparked another round of verbal attacks on Carnes. Joffre doesn't care about the voices from the front lines, he only conjures up his own plans in his head. He's completely out of touch with reality and won't listen to any advice. He's the one who killed Colonel Delian. And countless other brave French soldiers. Carnes, sweating profusely, still mustered his courage and shouted to the audience, "No, gentlemen, that's not the case. It's not General Joffre's fault. We have British intelligence support. Besides, I believe no one could have done any better in the same situation." The members of Parliament below laughed. Oman, speaking with a flippant tone, called out to Keynes, "General, do you seem to have forgotten that the person sitting in front of you is Charles?" The councillors burst into laughter again. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.